In a single New York tenement room in the 1880s, a family of 7 might share 400 square feet of living space with no running water, no bathroom, and almost no ventilation. Yet from these cramped, disease-ridden spaces emerged the workforce that transformed America into an industrial giant virtually overnight. This is the story of one such family, the Murphys, and their journey through the grinding realities and flickering hopes of Gilded Age New York. The scraping sound of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestones pulled Daniel Murphy from sleep before dawn. Before his eyes even opened, his body registered the weight of his youngest child, Sarah, who had crawled into the shared bed during the night. The stifling air in the small tenement room already carried the smell of boiling cabbage and coal smoke from other apartments. His back ached from the thin corn husk mattress that did little to cushion against the rope bed frame beneath. Unlike the comfortable mattress you're lying on now, this bed offered no comfort, only a slight barrier between a working man and the floor. It was 1882 in New York's Lower East Side, and Daniel had exactly 17 minutes to get himself ready before he needed to leave for the ironworks. 17 minutes to transform from exhausted father to functional machine operator. 17 minutes that would determine whether he earned today's pay or got replaced by any of the hundreds of desperate men waiting outside the factory gates. Daniel carefully shifted his daughter Sarah back to the pallet she shared with her brother Thomas, without waking either of them. The room was small, so small that with a single step he could touch the wall that separated their living space from the Kowalskis next door. From the other side he could hear Mrs. Kowalski's chronic cough, tuberculosis probably. The disease thrived in these buildings where sunlight never reached and air barely circulated. "You thinking of getting up any time today?" his wife Margaret whispered from the small stove where she was already heating water. Her silhouette was barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. "Was enjoying my luxury accommodations too much," Daniel replied with a quiet laugh, careful not to wake his mother, who slept in the room's only chair, her arthritis making a bed impossible. The bizarre intimacy of tenement life was something one never truly got used to. You didn't just live with your family, you lived with their every sound, smell, and bodily function, and not just your family. The paper-thin walls meant you knew exactly when Mr. Rossi from upstairs was fighting with his wife, when the twins on the first floor were sick, and which of your neighbours snored like freight trains. Margaret handed Daniel a chipped cup of what passed for coffee, mostly chicory with just enough actual coffee to maintain the fiction. It was hot, though, and that was what mattered. In the 1880s, that morning cup hit different. It wasn't about flavour profiles or cute barista art. It was fuel, pure and simple. "Thomas already left?" Daniel asked, noticing his son's empty sleeping space. "Had to," Margaret replied, stoking the embers in the stove. "Said something about getting a good corner for the morning edition." Daniel nodded. At 16, their son had the hustle that might actually get him somewhere in this new America. Newspaper boys who secured prime locations could double their sales, and Thomas had been saving every spare penny, not for candy or entertainment, mind you. The boy had bigger dreams, dreams of an education that neither Daniel nor Margaret had ever had. Looking round their one-room home in the dim light, Daniel took quick stock of their world. A rope bed shared by him and Margaret, pallets on the floor for the children, a small stove, a table with 3 mismatched chairs, a trunk containing everything they owned that wasn't currently being worn or used, and one window that opened not to the street, but to an air shaft so narrow you could touch both sides if you stuck your arms out. You're probably thinking, why would anyone live like this? Well, when the alternative was starving in Ireland after the potato famine or fleeing religious persecution in Eastern Europe, suddenly a cramped tenement in America seemed like winning the lottery. At least here there was the possibility of something better. Maybe not for you, but for your kids. The unspoken promise of America was always for the next generation. Daniel splashed water on his face from the basin, the same water the whole family would use throughout the day, carried up 5 flights of stairs by Thomas last night. Indoor plumbing. That was for the wealthy folks uptown. Here in the tenements, you were lucky if the shared toilet in the backyard wasn't overflowing, and even luckier if it wasn't a cesspool of disease. "Fixed your shirt best I could," Margaret said, handing him his work shirt with newly mended tears where sparks had landed yesterday. The fabric was thin from too many washings, but it was clean. A point of pride for Margaret, who refused to let her family look like they'd given up despite the crushing circumstances. "You're a miracle worker," he said, feeling the neat stitches with calloused fingers. The skin on his hands was tough as leather now, cracked in places from the constant heat and cold of metalwork. Hands that had once worked a small farm in County Cork now manipulated industrial machines that would have seemed like science fiction to his father. The contrast between his past and present was a constant, subtle ache. Daniel dressed quickly in the semi-darkness. Privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford, but they had developed an elaborate choreography of turned backs and averted eyes that created the illusion of personal space where none existed. Imagine for a second your entire life, sleeping, eating, bathing, changing clothes, sickness, arguments, affection, all happening in a space about the size of a modern bathroom. No doors to close, no room to retreat to when you needed space, just constant, unrelenting togetherness. It was a test of patience and love, one they faced every single day. Outside, the city was already waking up. The sound of hooves and carriage wheels created a constant background rumble. Somewhere nearby, a factory whistle pierced the dawn. It was joined moments later by another, then another, until the air was filled with the industrial equivalent of roosters announcing the day. From other apartments, the sounds of waking families seeped through the walls, babies crying, a couple arguing in Italian, someone coughing violently, a man praying in Yiddish. This building housed people from 6 different countries, most of whom could barely communicate with each other except through nods and gestures. Yet they were bound together by the shared experience of starting over in America, a silent compact of mutual struggle. "Take this," Margaret said, pressing a bundle wrapped in cloth into his hands. Lunch, probably bread with a smear of lard if they were lucky, perhaps a thin slice of a pickled cucumber if a kind vendor had offered a discount. Daniel knew she was skipping her own meal to make sure he had strength for his 12-hour shift. Every calorie was precious, every bit of sustenance carefully allocated. "The Flannery boy came by yesterday," she continued, her voice low. "Said they're hiring at the glass factory. Better pay, he says." Daniel grunted. "Better pay because half of them die before 40. Glass dust in the lungs, burning, cuts." "No, Maggie. We're making it. Thomas has his papers. Sarah helps with your sewing. We've got more than most." He tried to project confidence, to quell the tremor of fear he knew was always present in her. "I know." She straightened his collar in a gesture that was part practicality, part affection. "Just thought you should know." This was the constant calculation of working-class life in the 1880s, weighing slightly better pay against increased risk of death or dismemberment. There was no workers' compensation back then, no health insurance. If you got injured on the job, tough luck, buddy. There were 50 guys outside who'd take your spot before your blood dried on the floor. The factory owners held all the cards, and the workers had only their bodies to wager. Daniel kissed his wife quickly, touched his mother's shoulder gently so as not to wake her, but to feel the reassurance of her steady breathing, and took one last look at his sleeping children. Then he was out the door, joining the river of humanity flowing down the tenement stairs. The stairwell was its own ecosystem. The smell hit him first, a combination of boiled cabbage, unwashed bodies, wet laundry, and the distinct tang of too many humans sharing too little space. The steps themselves were worn in the middle, wooden boards sagging from decades of use, polished smooth by countless desperate feet. One flight down, Mrs. Abramowitz was already sweeping her small patch of landing, a ritual of futile tidiness against the grime of the building. She nodded at Daniel, their daily acknowledgement that transcended their language barrier. Second floor. The smell of fresh bread as the Reiki family prepared for their day, running a small bakery 2 streets over. The aroma made Daniel's stomach growl, reminding him that yesterday's dinner was thin soup stretched to feed 5 people, a meagre offering that left them all wanting. Ground floor. Mr. Giannopoulos sat on a stool by the entrance, smoking his pipe. The old Greek seemed to never sleep, functioning as an unofficial watchman for the building, his presence a silent comfort to many. He tapped his pipe in greeting as Daniel passed. "Cold one at the factory today," he said, one of the few English phrases he'd mastered, used regardless of the actual weather or Daniel's destination. "Always is," Daniel replied with a half-smile, completing their daily ritual. And then he was outside, joining the mass of humanity that flooded the streets of the Lower East Side each morning. The contrast always hit him like a physical force. Inside the tenement, despite its crowding, There was a certain intimacy, a shared understanding born of proximity and struggle. These were people he knew, lives intertwined with his own. Outside, it was a churning ocean of strangers, all moving with the same urgent purpose, each an island in a vast, indifferent sea. The street itself was a sensory assault. In 2025, you probably think you know what a busy street sounds like. Honking cars, rumbling buses, the occasional siren. But the noise of an 1880s New York street was different, more organic, more varied, somehow both louder and more textured. There was the clatter of thousands of hooves on cobblestones, the grinding of iron-rimmed wheels, the calls of street vendors already setting up. "Hot corn! Get your hot corn!" The shouts of children who had escaped apartments to play in the gutters, the barking of stray dogs, the mechanical clang from workshops whose doors stood open to the morning air, and the smell. Oh man, the smell! Horse manure everywhere, rotting vegetables from yesterday's market, sewage from overflowing gutters, smoke from 1,000 chimneys, the tang of unwashed bodies packed tightly together. It was like a physical presence, something you moved through rather than simply detected. You're thinking, this sounds awful. Why didn't they do something about it? Well, here's the thing. For most people, this was just normal. They didn't know any different, and if you'd grown up with these conditions, you probably wouldn't even notice most of it. Your senses dulled by constant exposure. As Daniel navigated the crowded street, he passed evidence of the rapid transformation gripping America. On one corner, workers were installing electric streetlights, cutting-edge technology that would gradually replace the gas lamps that had lit the city for decades. Across the street, a new telephone wire was being strung between buildings, part of the growing communication network that was shrinking distances in ways that would have seemed magical just a generation ago. A horse-drawn omnibus rumbled past, packed with passengers headed downtown, while just a block away, construction continued on the elevated railway that would soon carry electric trains above the street traffic. Old and new, existing side by side in a city reinventing itself daily, a dizzying dance of progress. 3 blocks from home, Daniel passed a construction site where a new skyscraper was rising, 10 stories tall, an almost unimaginable height made possible by recent advances in steel production and elevator technology. He paused for a moment, looking up at the skeletal framework. Impressive, isn't it? Daniel turned to find Thomas alongside him, his newspaper bag still full of morning editions. "Shouldn't you be selling those?" Daniel nodded at the papers. "Heading there now. Wanted to catch you first." Thomas glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then lowered his voice. "Mr. Sullivan at the newsstand says there's talk of a strike at the ironworks." Daniel's jaw tightened. Strikes were dangerous territory, necessary for better conditions, but often leading to violence and lost jobs. Men had been killed for less. "Just talk for now," he said carefully. "Don't mention it to your mother. No need to worry her." Thomas nodded, understanding the unspoken complexities. At 16, he had already learned to navigate the dangerous waters of labour relations, politics and survival. Childhood didn't last long in the tenements. "Be careful today," his son said with a seriousness that shouldn't belong to someone so young. "Always am." Daniel ruffled his son's hair, a gesture that Thomas would normally protest as too childish, but today he allowed it. "Sell all those papers and stay out of trouble." They parted ways at the next corner. Thomas headed toward the busier commercial streets where businessmen might buy morning papers. Daniel continued toward the industrial district, where smoke already darkened the morning sky. As he walked, Daniel passed other scenes of daily life. In the 1880s New York, a group of women lined up at a public water pump, waiting their turn with buckets and containers. Children as young as 6 or 7 headed to factories where they'd work alongside adults for a fraction of the pay. A funeral procession, small and sparse, probably for a child given the size of the coffin. Death was a frequent visitor to the tenements, particularly among the youngest and oldest residents, a grim reaper ever present in their crowded lives. Near the corner of Orchard and Delancey, a commotion drew his attention. A crowd had gathered around a man standing on a wooden crate, shouting passionately about workers' rights and the need for organisation. Daniel slowed his pace slightly to listen. "They get rich from your sweat and blood," the man called out, his accent marking him as another Irish immigrant. "While your children go hungry and your wives work their fingers to the bone. Are we not men? Do we not deserve dignity?" Several police officers hovered at the edge of the gathering, watching with narrowed eyes. Public speeches like this often ended with broken heads and arrests. The speaker knew it too. Daniel could see him constantly scanning the crowd, ready to disappear at the first sign of trouble. One of the policemen made a move toward the speaker, and like magic the man vanished into the crowd, which dispersed in multiple directions. The dance of protest and suppression performed daily on the streets of industrial America. Daniel picked up his pace. The ironworks wouldn't wait, and being late meant being replaced. The crowd's quick dissolution left him thinking about the growing labour unrest spreading through American industries. Workers demanding things that seemed so basic now. A 10-hour workday instead of 12 or 14, 1 day off per week, safety measures, restrictions on child labour. Wild demands, right? Imagine thinking you deserve to work less than 14 hours a day, or that maybe 8-year-olds shouldn't operate heavy machinery. Absolute madness, some said. But to Daniel it was simply common sense, a plea for basic humanity. The industrial district loomed ahead, a landscape of brick factories with tall chimneys belching black smoke into the morning sky. The air grew noticeably thicker here, laden with coal dust and chemical smells. Daniel could feel it coating his lungs with each breath, another small tax on his health that he couldn't afford to think about. Outside the iron works, a crowd of men lingered, the desperate ones, hoping for a day's work if someone didn't show up or got injured. They watched Daniel with hungry eyes as he approached the gate, some nodding in recognition, others staring with barely concealed resentment. There, but for the grace of God go I, he thought. Knowing how easily he could be among them, a statistic in the endless churn of the city. The factory's whistle screamed 6 a.m. just as Daniel reached the entrance. The sound was physical, vibrating in his chest. The massive doors swung open, and the waiting workers flowed inside like a river finding its course. Inside the iron works was a vision of industrial hell that Dante himself might have imagined. Massive furnaces glowed orange in the dim light, radiating heat that would become unbearable by midday. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, obscured by hanging clouds of smoke and steam. Huge machines, steam hammers, presses, rollers, waited like sleeping monsters to be awakened for the day's work. The noise hit him next, a symphony of industrial production already beginning as the night shift workers finished their tasks. Metal striking metal, steam hissing through pipes, the roar of furnaces devouring coal, men shouting to be heard above the din. It wasn't just loud, it was all-encompassing, making normal conversation impossible, forcing workers to communicate through gestures and shouts, a primitive language of survival. Daniel made his way to his station, a massive rolling machine that flattened heated iron into sheets. The night shift operator, Mike Donahue, looked exhausted, his face streaked with sweat and grime, eyes red from smoke and lack of sleep. "Anything I should know?" Daniel asked, practically shouting to be heard. Mike shook his head. "Same as always. She's running hot on the left side. Watch your hands." He gestured to a spot on his own arm where a bandage peeked out from under his sleeve. "Got careless. Won't make that mistake again." That was the thing about factory work in the 1880s. The machines were designed for efficiency, not safety. No guards on moving parts, no emergency shutoffs, no concept of ergonomics. The human body was just another component in the industrial process, and a remarkably cheap one to replace when it broke down. As Mike left, Daniel removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms mapped with small burns and scars, the occupational signature of an ironworker. He tied a rag around his forehead to catch the sweat that would soon be pouring down his face. Another rag went around his neck to protect against sparks. It wasn't much protection, but it was better than nothing, a symbolic defiance against the inevitable. Around him, the day shift took their positions. Men nodded to each other in greeting, saving their breath and voices for when they'd been needed. Many had worked alongside Daniel for years, forming the kind of bond that came from sharing daily danger, a brotherhood forged in fire. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking equipment, adjusting settings, preparing for the day's production quota. Between customers, he kept a watchful eye on his surroundings. The street was a complex ecosystem with its own rules and hierarchies. Knowing who to avoid, who to befriend, and who to watch could mean the difference between a profitable day and a dangerous one. There was Officer Sullivan making his rounds, twirling his nightstick. He was generally fair with the newsboys as long as they stayed out of trouble. The fruit vendor on the opposite corner who sometimes traded bruised apples for day-old papers. The gang of older boys who controlled the territory 2 blocks south and demanded protection payments from younger kids working their turf. "Hey, Irish!" Thomas tensed at the call, recognizing the voice of Butch Williams, leader of the corner boys, who'd been trying to expand their territory northward. "Little busy here, Butch," Thomas responded, deliberately turning his attention to a potential customer approaching. Butch sauntered closer, flanked by 2 of his regular companions. At 15, he had already developed the hard look of someone who expected life to be a constant battle. "This is our corner now. 5 cents a day for you to work here." The businessman who was approaching diverted his path, wanting no part of the brewing confrontation. Thomas sighed internally. This dance again. "We've been through this. Sullivan says this corner is fair game for anyone. Take it up with him if you've got a problem." Butch stepped closer, his intention clearly intimidation. "Sullivan ain't here right now, is he?" "Actually, he is." Thomas spotted the officer rounding the corner, his attention immediately drawn to the cluster of boys. "Problem here, lads," Sullivan called out, his Irish brogue thickening as it always did when he was asserting authority. Butch's demeanour transformed instantly. "No, sir, officer. Just saying good morning to my friend Thomas here." "Awful lot of boys for a simple good morning," Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps you'd be better off selling your papers over on Cedar Street." The message was clear. Butch forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just heading there now, sir." He turned to Thomas, keeping his voice low. "This ain't over, Irish." As Butch and his boys retreated, Thomas nodded appreciatively to Officer Sullivan. These small alliances were crucial for survival on the streets. A friendly policeman, a sympathetic shopkeeper, the other newsboys who watched your back. No one made it alone. "Thanks," Thomas said simply. Sullivan tapped his nightstick against his palm. "Your father still at the ironworks?" "Yes, sir. 3 years now." "Good man, your father. Tell him Mike Sullivan says hello." With that, he continued his patrol. This was the complex web of connections that immigrants created. Irish looking out for Irish, Italians for Italians, Jews for Jews. Not because of any inherent distrust of others, but because these shared backgrounds created instant understanding. Officer Sullivan didn't need Thomas to explain why selling papers mattered, why territory disputes were serious business, or why a day's lost earnings could mean a family going hungry. He knew because he'd lived it himself, or seen his own family live it. The morning rush began to thin as 9 o'clock approached. Thomas did a quick count of his remaining papers and the coins in his pocket. A decent morning, but not exceptional. He'd need to find a new angle for the midday edition if he wanted to make his target for the day. Maybe the financial district for lunch, or perhaps the ladies shopping on Broadway in the afternoon. Each location had its own rhythm, its own customers, its own approach. Learning these patterns was essential for maximizing sales. A street musician set up nearby, his violin case open for coins. The simple melodies drew a small crowd, creating a momentary pause in the city's relentless forward motion. Thomas watched, calculating whether the crowd might include potential customers or if he should move to a more profitable location. The musician caught his eye and nodded slightly, an acknowledgement between 2 people trying to make a living on the streets. Thomas returned the nod. No competition here, just different hustles in the same space. This was a key survival skill in 1880s urban America, knowing when to compete and when to cooperate. Resources were scarce, opportunities limited. Those who navigated these waters successfully were those who could read the social landscape accurately and adjust accordingly. Back in the tenement, 12-year-old Sarah Murphy moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. With her mother at the garment workshop, her father at the ironworks, and Thomas selling papers, she was effectively in charge of the household until evening. First priority, water. The family's bucket was nearly empty, which meant a trip to the public pump in the courtyard. Sarah grabbed the bucket and headed downstairs, joining the line of women and children waiting their turn. Ahead of her, Mrs. Petrovich from the 3rd floor argued with Mrs. O'Brien from the 2nd about who was in line first. Behind her, 8-year-old Vinnie Rossi bounced impatiently, his own bucket almost as big as he was. The pump was community theatre, a place where the building's dramas played out daily against the backdrop of this most essential task. "Did you hear about the Flanagan boy?" Mrs. O'Brien's voice carried down the line. "Consumption, they're saying. Doctor gave him 3 months. Tuberculosis or consumption. was the constant spectre haunting tenement life. The crowded conditions, poor ventilation and shared air made it spread like wildfire once it found a foothold. Everyone knew someone who had died of it, and everyone lived in fear of the telltale cough that might signal their own infection. Sarah tried not to think about the fact that Mrs. Kowalski next door had been coughing for months now, about how the sound travelled through the thin walls at night, about how much thinner the woman looked each time Sarah saw her. When her turn at the pump finally came, Sarah worked the handle vigorously, filling her bucket with the questionable water that passed for clean in the tenements. It wasn't the clear, pure water you might imagine. It was slightly cloudy with a faint metallic taste, but it was what they had. Carrying the full bucket back up 5 flights of stairs was a test of strength and balance. Spill too much, and it meant another trip down. By the time she reached the apartment, her arms ached, but she'd managed to keep most of the precious liquid. Inside, Grandmother Murphy had already begun her own work for the day, mending a pair of Thomas's trousers that had torn at the knee. Her fingers, twisted with arthritis, moved slowly but precisely, each stitch placed with care born from decades of practice. "You got the water, good girl," she said without looking up. "Now check on the Kowalskis. Mrs. Kowalski was coughing something fierce in the night." Sarah set down the bucket and nodded. This was another part of tenement life. Neighbours checking on neighbours, creating an informal support network in the absence of official help. She grabbed a small jar of the honey that her mother had been saving for just this purpose and headed next door. She knocked softly, then a bit louder when there was no response. Finally, the door opened to reveal Mr. Kowalski, his face haggard from lack of sleep. "Sarah Murphy," she introduced herself unnecessarily. Of course, he knew who she was. Ma sent honey for Mrs. Kowalski's cough. Mr. Kowalski took the jar with a nod of thanks. Behind him, Sarah could see Mrs. Kowalski lying on their bed, a thin sheet covering her despite the room's warmth. Her cheeks were flushed with fever, her breathing laboured. "The doctor," Sarah began hesitantly. "Has he—" $5, Mr. Kowalski said, his accent thick with fatigue and worry. $5 to come. Where I get $5? It wasn't really a question, and Sarah had no answer to offer. $5 was nearly a week's wages for many workers. The choice between medical care and feeding your family was no choice at all for most. Evening in the tenements had its own rhythm, different from the mechanized cadence of daytime labour. As families reunited in their tiny spaces, the building transformed from a collection of empty rooms to a vibrant, overcrowded hive of humanity. The Murphy apartment was no exception, and by 7 p.m. all 5 family members had returned, filling the small room with movement, conversation, and the mingled smells of bodies that had worked hard in summer heat. 15 papers left over, Thomas announced, emptying his coin pouch onto the table for the family accounting. This daily ritual, pooling the family's earnings, was treated with appropriate solemnity. In an economy where pennies mattered, even children understood the weight of financial contribution. "Good day," Daniel nodded, adding his own pay envelope. Unlike Thomas's loose coins, his wages came in an official packet, his name scrolled on the outside. Inside was exactly $1.75. Today's pay minus the 25 cents automatic deduction for the company store where workers were expected to purchase their tools and supplies. Margaret added her earnings from the garment shop, plus showed the extra piecework she'd brought home. 3 cents each if we can finish them by Friday. Together they counted the day's intake. Survival for another day, perhaps a bit extra for the always growing list of necessities. No one mentioned how Daniel's pay was 15 cents short of last week. No one needed to. The shrinking paycheck could mean anything from reduced orders to a first warning from management who'd heard whispers of his interest in the Ironworkers Union. Sarah tended the small pot of soup still simmering on the stove, adding the last precious ingredients, a carrot saved from yesterday, a handful of beans soaked since morning, a few scraps of salt pork for flavour. The single room filled with the aroma, triggering a collective stomach growl that broke the serious mood and sent them all into laughter. "Sounds like music," Grandmother Murphy said with a wink. "A whole Murphy symphony." This was how you survived the hardship, finding humour in small moments, making lightness where there was none, creating joy from nothing but shared experience and the human capacity for laughter. Dinner in a tenement was nothing like modern meals. No separate courses, no individual plates, Just the communal pot, a loaf of bread, and perhaps a bit of cheese or fruit if times were good. The Murphys ate together, passing a shared spoon for the soup, tearing chunks from the day-old bread that Margaret got at a discount from the bakery. "Mrs. Kowalski's worse," Sarah reported between bites. "Mr. Kowalski says the doctor wants $5 to come." Daniel and Margaret exchanged looks loaded with unspoken communication. $5 was impossible, nearly half a week's wages. Yet the Kowalskis were neighbours, and in the tenements, neighbourly bonds could be as strong as family. "I'll speak with Father Donovan tomorrow," Margaret said finally. "The parish sometimes helps with medical needs." Thomas looked up from his soup. "I heard St. Vincent's Hospital takes charity cases. Maybe they could go there." "Nobody comes back from charity hospitals," Grandmother Murphy muttered. "You go in standing and come out lying down, if you know what I mean." She wasn't entirely wrong. Public hospitals in the 1880s were places of last resort, often understaffed, unhygienic, and overwhelmed. Many saw them as death houses rather than places of healing. Private doctors were expensive, but at least offered the comfort of home treatment. "The O'Malleys on the second floor," Daniel said slowly. "Their eldest is at medical school now. Perhaps he could take a look for practice." This was another crucial survival mechanism. Knowing who in your community had useful skills or connections, the informal economy of favours and bargains that operated alongside the cash economy, especially among immigrant groups. "I'll ask in the morning," Sarah volunteered, already planning her approach. With dinner finished, they transitioned to evening work. No leisure time here. Every waking hour needed to be productive when margins were so thin. Daniel repaired a loose floorboard that had been catching on Margaret's skirt. Margaret and Grandmother began work on the extra sewing, their fingers moving with practiced precision despite the day's accumulated fatigue. Thomas reviewed the headlines from today's papers, preparing to share news with the family. This evening ritual of news sharing served multiple purposes. It kept the family connected to the wider world beyond their immediate struggles. It helped Thomas practice his reading, and it provided a framework for Daniel and Margaret to impart values and perspectives to their children through discussion of current events. "President Arthur gave a speech about civil service reform," Thomas began, squinting at the small print in the fading light. "Says government jobs should go to qualified people, not just friends of politicians." "Huh?" Daniel couldn't contain his skeptical reaction. "And I'm sure the politicians are falling all over themselves to give up their patronage powers." "What's patronage?" Sarah asked, looking up from where she was sorting fabric scraps by colour. "Even the smallest pieces saved for quilting or patching." "It's how the world works, little one," Grandmother Murphy answered before Daniel could. "Those with power hand out jobs and favours to their friends and family. Always been that way." "Doesn't make it right," Daniel countered. "Systems rotten through. Same in government as in the factories. Those at the top looking out for each other while the rest of us scramble for crumbs." There was an edge to his voice that made Margaret glance at him sharply. This kind of talk, this questioning of the established order, could be dangerous if carried beyond these walls, especially with union whispers already circulating at the ironworks. "What else, Thomas?" she asked, deliberately steering the conversation towards safer waters. "The Brooklyn Bridge construction continues," Thomas read. "They say it will be the longest suspension bridge in the world when it's finished." "Now that's something I'd like to see," Daniel said, his mood shifting. "Imagine walking all the way across the East River with nothing but air beneath you." The Brooklyn Bridge represented something beyond its engineering marvels. It symbolized connection, physically linking Manhattan and Brooklyn, conceptually bridging old technology and new possibilities. For immigrants especially, it embodied the American promise of overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles through human ingenuity and effort. "They say 20 men have died building it already," Thomas continued, reading further. And there it was, the other side of progress. The human cost rarely mentioned in the celebratory newspaper accounts. The workers who fell from heights, who suffered in caissons under the river, who paid with their bodies for each foot of advancement. As Thomas continued sharing news items, a sudden commotion in the hallway interrupted. Raised voices, a door slamming, then the unmistakable sound of Mrs. Kowalski's coughing, now with a wet, rattling quality that made everyone in the Murphy apartment fall silent. Margaret made the sign of the cross almost unconsciously. They all recognized that sound, consumption in its later stages, when the lungs began to fail in earnest, when the end was no longer a distant possibility but an approaching certainty. "First thing tomorrow," Daniel said quietly. Thomas, you'll go find the O'Malley boy before your paper route. Thomas nodded solemnly. Yes, Pa. The evening continued with work punctuated by conversation, but the reminder of Mrs. Kowalski's illness cast a shadow over the room. This, too, was part of tenement life, the constant proximity to suffering and death, the reminder of your own vulnerability, the knowledge that the same fate could easily befall your own family. Around 8:30, a welcome distraction arrived in the form of music drifting through the open window. Someone in the building had produced a fiddle and was playing folk tunes in the courtyard below. Soon, other instruments joined. A penny whistle, a small accordion, improvised percussion on upturned buckets. Ukrainian music, Grandmother Murphy identified, her foot tapping slightly to the rhythm, similar to our own jigs in some ways. The music grew as more neighbours emerged from their apartments to listen or join in. Even in the crushing poverty of the tenements, people found ways to create beauty and community. Music, storytelling, shared celebrations of births, marriages, religious holidays. These weren't luxuries, but necessities, reminders of humanity in dehumanizing conditions. Daniel moved to the window, looking down at the impromptu gathering. Sarah, would you like to go down for a little while? The girl's face lit up. These rare moments of leisure were precious, especially in summer when the courtyard became a communal living room for the building's residents. Can I, Ma? She asked, already knowing Margaret would be reluctant. Work first, Margaret said, gesturing to the fabric still waiting to be sorted. Sarah's hands moved with lightning speed, completing her task with efficiency born of hope. Done. Margaret sighed but smiled. Half an hour, no more, and take Thomas with you. The children needed no further encouragement, racing for the door with a boundless energy that somehow replenished itself, even after long days of work. Their exit left a sudden quiet in the apartment, broken only by the distant music and the rhythmic sound of needle through fabric. You should rest, Margaret told Daniel, noticing the deeper lines of fatigue around his eyes. Tomorrow comes early. Daniel took a seat beside his mother, picking up one of the shirtwaist pieces. Though his fingers were calloused from metalwork, they retained enough dexterity for the simpler stitches. This too was typical of working families, men contributing to women's work when needed, gender divisions becoming flexible in the face of necessity. They worked in companionable silence for several minutes before Daniel spoke again, his voice low. There was a man at the factory today talking about organising. Margaret's hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their rhythm. Dangerous talk. Necessary talk, he countered. Fitzgerald lost 3 fingers yesterday. No compensation. Not even a doctor provided. Back to work today or lose his position. And how will his family eat if he loses his job entirely? Margaret asked the practical question that haunted every discussion of labour action. Daniel had no immediate answer. This was the impossible choice facing workers in the 1880s: accept dangerous conditions and exploitation, or risk the little security they had by fighting for something better. Downstairs in the courtyard, Thomas and Sarah found themselves in the centre of a multicultural celebration. The Ukrainian music had inspired others to contribute their own cultural traditions. An Italian family demonstrated folk dances. A group of Jewish children taught others a circle game. 2 Chinese brothers, rare residents in this predominantly European immigrant building, showed off tricks with the diabolo. It's like having the whole world in one courtyard, Sarah said, watching with wide eyes. Thomas, worldlier at 16, nodded, but kept a protective hand on his sister's shoulder. The community gathering was joyful, but he was aware of undercurrents, the young men eyeing girls from different ethnic groups with interest that might cause trouble. The older residents watching the mixing of cultures with varying degrees of approval, the potential for festivity to transform into conflict when different traditions collided. Sarah, Thomas. Rosa Abramovitz waved from where she stood with a group of other young people. Come meet my cousin Esther. She's just arrived from Poland. They made their way through the crowd. The cousin looked overwhelmed, her eyes wide at the noise and movement around her. She was dressed in clothing that immediately marked her as fresh off the boat, old country styles that would soon be replaced as she adapted to her new home. She doesn't speak English yet, Rosa explained. But I'm teaching her. Show her your trick, Thomas. Thomas reached into his pocket and produced a penny, which he proceeded to walk across his knuckles in a fluid movement that delighted both Rosa's cousin and the other children who gathered to watch. "How'd you learn that?" a boy asked, trying unsuccessfully to imitate the movement. "Man who sells newspapers down at the harbour," Thomas explained. "Says he learned it on sailing ships to pass the time on long voyages." This casual exchange of skills, this constant learning and adaptation, characterized immigrant communities. Each person brought knowledge from their homeland and acquired new abilities in America, creating a rich cultural exchange that happened not in universities or formal settings, but in courtyards, workshops, and kitchens. The music shifted to something with a faster tempo, and several couples began dancing in the limited space. The summer evening had cooled slightly, making physical activity more bearable. Laughter rose above the melody as dancers collided or improvised steps from different cultural traditions. "Look!" Sarah pointed toward the entrance to the courtyard where a well-dressed man stood observing the scene, with an expression of mingled fascination and distaste. "Who's that?" Thomas followed her gaze. "Rent collector, maybe, or one of those reformer types who come to study how the poor live." The 1880s saw the beginning of organised efforts to document and improve tenement conditions. Social reformers, journalists and early sociologists ventured into neighbourhoods like this one, gathering information that would eventually lead to housing reforms. But from the residents' perspective, these visits often felt like invasions, their hardship transformed into spectacle for middle-class consumption. The stranger noticed their attention and approached, confirming Thomas's second guess. "Remarkable gathering," he said, his accent marking him as educated. "I'm Jacob Rees, photographer and journalist. I'm documenting conditions in the tenements for a book." "Documenting?" Thomas repeated, the unfamiliar word catching his attention. "Recording through photographs and writing." Rees gestured to the camera bag slung over his shoulder. "Would you mind if I asked you a few questions about life here?" Thomas hesitated, calculating the potential risks and benefits of engaging with this outsider. On one hand, perhaps publicity could lead to improvements. On the other, talking too freely about tenement conditions might reflect poorly on his family, suggesting they didn't maintain their home properly despite Margaret's best efforts. "What kind of questions?" he asked cautiously. "How many people live in your apartment? How much is the rent? Where do you work?" Simple facts to help people understand how families like yours live. Rees pulled out a small notebook, pencil poised. Before Thomas could decide how to respond, Sarah stepped forward with the directness of childhood. 7 people in our room, $3 a week rent. Pa works at the ironworks, Ma at the garment shop. Thomas sells papers. I help at home, and grandmother does piecework sewing. "Oh, Sarah," Thomas tried to silence her, but the information had already been shared. 7 people in one room, Rees repeated, scribbling notes. "And the sanitary arrangements?" 1 toilet in the yard for 20 families, Sarah continued, seemingly unaware of Thomas's discomfort. "Water from the pump downstairs. We carry it up 5 flights. Rees continued making notes, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts on these conditions. "And illness? Is there much sickness in the building?" At this, Thomas put a protective arm around Sarah and stepped back. "We stay healthy enough. If you'll excuse us, sir, we should return to our family." As they moved away, Sarah looked confused. "Did I say something wrong?" "Not wrong," Thomas explained gently, "just private. People like him. They look at us like we're some kind of, I don't know, animals in a zoo, something to study. They don't really see us." It was a sophisticated observation for a 16-year-old, but Thomas had received an education beyond books, the street-level understanding of how power works, how different classes view each other, how the same reality can be interpreted in radically different ways depending on who's doing the looking. The half-hour Margaret allowed had stretched to nearly an hour when Thomas finally shepherded Sarah back toward the stairs. The courtyard celebration continued behind them, likely to last until someone complains or exhaustion claims the revellers. As they climbed the stairs, the building revealed its nighttime character. Doors that stayed closed during the day now stood open for ventilation, offering glimpses into the lives of their neighbours. An old man teaching chess to his grandson. A young couple stealing a moment of intimacy in the believed privacy of their doorway. A group of men playing cards and passing a bottle. a mother singing softly to an infant who refused to sleep in the heat. Each apartment contained its own world, its own drama of survival, connection, conflict, and occasional joy. Multiply this by thousands of buildings across the city, and you begin to grasp the extraordinary tapestry of immigrant life in 1880s America. Millions of individual stories unfolding simultaneously, each feeling like the centre of its own universe. Back in the Murphy apartment, Margaret was putting away the sewing for the night. "You're late," she said, but without real anger. The sound of the music still drifting upward explained the delay without words needed. "There's a photographer downstairs," Thomas reported. "Says he's documenting tenement conditions." Daniel looked up sharply. "You didn't talk to him, did you?" Sarah did a little. Thomas shot his sister an apologetic look for the implied accusation. Sarah, sensing the sudden tension, moved closer to her grandmother for protection. "I just told him facts about our room and the water and such," Daniel sighed. "No harm done. I suppose these reformer types come and go, take their pictures, write their articles, go back to their comfortable homes, feeling they've done something important." His cynicism wasn't entirely fair, though he had no way of knowing it. Jacob Riis's photographs and writings would eventually help spark genuine housing reforms. But from the perspective of 1882, such improvement seemed impossibly distant, and the gap between observation and action unbridgeably wide. As the hour grew later, the family prepared for sleep. In winter, they would all crowd into the single bed for warmth, but summer heat made such proximity unbearable. Instead, they spread out as much as the small space allowed. Daniel and Margaret on the rope bed, Thomas on a pallet near the door, Sarah sharing a corner with her grandmother. The building gradually quieted as exhaustion claimed its residents. The music in the courtyard faded, voices lowered, doors closed. From other apartments, the sounds of night-time replaced those of evening, soft snoring, occasional coughing, the creak of rope beds as sleepers turned, seeking comfort on unyielding surfaces. Sleep was rarely peaceful in the tenements. Too hot in summer, too cold in winter, too many bodies in too little space, too many sounds penetrating thin walls, too many worries about tomorrow's challenges. Yet somehow they managed. The human body's need for rest eventually overcame even the most adverse conditions. Daniel lay awake longer than the others, staring at the ceiling, barely visible in the darkness. His thoughts cycled through the day's events, lingering on the organizer at the factory and the photographer in the courtyard. Both outsiders in different ways, both promising some form of change or recognition, both requiring a faith that seemed increasingly difficult to maintain. From the street below came the sound of the night watchman calling the hour. 11 o'clock, and all is well. All is not well, Daniel thought. Not in the tenements where families crowd into single rooms. Not in the factories where men lose limbs without compensation. Not in a society where some dine on multiple courses served on fine china, while others stretch watery soup to feed 5 hungry mouths. Yet, as he finally drifted towards sleep, Daniel held on to a fragile hope. Thomas's quick mind and entrepreneurial spirit, Sarah's determination to learn despite the obstacles, the small improvements they'd managed, moving from a basement apartment to this 5th-floor room with its window, saving enough for Margaret to buy a used sewing machine last Christmas, establishing themselves as people who pay their rent on time and help their neighbours when possible. It wasn't the American dream as depicted in the dime novels. No instant riches, no miraculous rise from rags to respectability. It was something smaller, but perhaps more meaningful. The slow, grinding progress of one family fighting for dignity in a system designed to deny it to them. The foundation being laid for children who might climb a little higher, and their children higher still. Outside, the city continued its nighttime existence. Factories running night shifts, saloons serving workers drowning the day's hardships, police patrolling streets where different dangers emerged after dark. Tenements like this one housing the workforce that powered America's industrial miracle. The human machinery behind the Gilded Age that received little of the gilding. Tomorrow would bring more of the same. More work, more struggle, more moments of connection amid hardship. The Murphy family would rise before dawn, moving through their carefully choreographed morning routine in the small space they shared. They'd disperse to their various labours, contribute their efforts to the vast industrial organism that was New York, then return again to this room that was both trap and sanctuary. And in this cycle, repeated across thousands of families in hundreds of cities, America continued its transformation from agrarian nation to industrial powerhouse, built on the bent backs and calloused hands of people like the Murphys, who asked little except the chance to work, to learn, and perhaps to see their children achieve what they could not. The nighttime breeze carried a momentary relief from the heat through the open window. In the near distance, factory whistles marked the changing of shifts, the industrial heartbeat that never stopped. Closer, someone coughed in their sleep, the sound echoing in the air shaft. A baby cried briefly before being soothed, and life in the tenements continued hour by hour, night by night, holding both struggle and possibility in the same cramped spaces. This was America in the 1880s, not as recorded in official histories, but as lived by the millions whose names rarely appear in textbooks, but whose collective effort built the nation we recognize today. Morning arrived with brutal efficiency in the tenements. No gentle transition from sleep to wakefulness, just the sudden demands of survival yanking you back to consciousness. For the Murphys, dawn brought the same carefully orchestrated dance of bodies moving through limited space, each person performing their role in the daily ritual of getting ready. Thomas was already gone, having left before first light to find the O'Malley boy studying medicine. Daniel dressed quickly in the semi-darkness, while Margaret heated water for washing and tea. Sarah helped her grandmother from the makeshift bed they shared, easing the older woman's stiff joints into movement. Mrs. Kowalski was quiet last night, Grandmother Murphy observed as Sarah helped her to a chair. Not a good sign when the coughing stops. The words hung in the room, their implication clear to everyone. Tuberculosis followed a cruel pattern, periods of violent coughing alternating with deceptive quiet as the disease progressed through the lungs. The absence of coughing often signalled not improvement, but deterioration too severe for the body to mount even that defence. A knock at the door interrupted the morning routine. Margaret answered to find Thomas standing there with a young man she vaguely recognised. Patrick O'Malley, now transformed from the gangly boy who once lived downstairs into a serious-looking medical student with a small black bag. Found him at his parents' apartment, Thomas explained. He's willing to look in on Mrs. Kowalski before his classes. Patrick nodded respectfully to Margaret. Mrs. Murphy, Thomas explained the situation. I'd be happy to help if I can, though I should be clear. I'm only in my second year of studies. You've had more training than anyone else in this building, Margaret said, the urgency in her voice overriding social formalities. The Kowalskis can't afford a doctor, and Mrs. Kowalski is... She didn't finish the sentence. I understand. Patrick's expression revealed his awareness of what awaited him next door. I'll do what I can. This was another aspect of immigrant community life. The pride in those who managed to climb a rung on the social ladder, and the expectation that they would use their new position to help those still struggling below. Patrick's medical education represented achievement not just for his immediate family, but for the entire building. His willingness to help the Kowalskis validated that collective investment in his success. As Patrick crossed the hall to the Kowalski apartment, Daniel finished dressing for work. I'll be late tonight, he told Margaret, his voice low, meeting after shift. The brief statement carried volumes of unspoken meaning, a labour meeting, potentially dangerous. Don't wait up, don't worry. Margaret merely nodded, her expression carefully neutral. Be careful. With those two words, she acknowledged the risk while accepting his decision. Their partnership, like many immigrant marriages, was built on practical support rather than romantic ideals. Each respected the other's judgment in their respective domains, stepping back when necessary, stepping forward when needed. Daniel kissed her quickly, touched Sarah's head in passing, and nodded to his mother before heading out. The ironworks whistle would blow in 30 minutes, and he couldn't afford to be late, especially with whispers of union activity making management more vigilant about any excuse to dismiss troublemakers. Thomas also prepared to leave, his newspaper route calling, but first he pulled a small paper-wrapped package from his pocket and handed it to Sarah. Almost forgot. Got this for you yesterday. Sarah unwrapped it to find a small slate pencil, her face lit with genuine delight at this modest treasure. a tool for her continued education that must have cost Thomas at least 2 cents. In a family where every penny was accounted for, this represented significant generosity. "Thank you." She threw her arms around her brother's waist, momentarily transforming from responsible assistant homemaker back into the 12-year-old girl she actually was. Thomas returned the hug awkwardly, embarrassed by his sister's enthusiasm but pleased by her reaction. "Just don't let Mrs. Henderson catch you practicing your letters when you should be sorting buttons," he warned, referring to Sarah's occasional assistance at the garment workshop where Margaret worked. After Thomas departed, Margaret and Sarah continued preparing for their day. The door to the Kowalski apartment opened, and Patrick O'Malley emerged, his face grave. He stopped at the Murphys' still-open door. "It's advanced," he said without preamble. "Both lungs. She needs real medical care, a sanatorium ideally, though I know that's—" He trailed off, acknowledging the impossibility of such an expense. "What can be done?" Margaret asked the practical question that always followed bad news in the tenements. Patrick hesitated. "I've given Mr. Kowalski instructions for keeping her comfortable, some techniques for helping her breathe easier. I'll bring some medicines from the university dispensary tonight. They sometimes give samples to students for practice. It's not much, but it's something." In a world where illness often meant helplessly watching loved ones suffer, even small interventions felt like meaningful action. "You're a good boy, Patrick," Grandmother Murphy said from her chair. "Your mother would be proud." The young man's expression softened slightly at this benediction from one of the building's matriarchs. "I'll check back tomorrow before classes." With a respectful nod, he headed toward the stairs. Margaret turned to practical matters. "Sarah, run down and tell Mrs. Abramowitz about Mrs. Kowalski. She'll organize the women to help with meals and cleaning." This, too, was how immigrant communities survived, through mutual aid networks that activated automatically in times of crisis. No formal organization, no official leadership, just the understood responsibility of neighbours to care for one another. Women who barely had enough to feed their own families would somehow find extra to share with the Kowalskis. Those with already overwhelming household duties would find time to help clean the sick room and wash contaminated linens. As Sarah departed on her errand, Margaret prepared for her own workday. The extra piecework from last night needed to be returned to Mrs. Goldstein, and there was a full day of garment assembly ahead. Before leaving, she laid out tasks for her mother-in-law and Sarah. Laundry to be done, vegetables to be prepared for soup, mending that needed attention. "I'll look in on Mrs. Kowalski midday," Grandmother Murphy promised as Margaret gathered her things. "Sarah shouldn't go in there too much. Children catch the consumption too easily." The fear was well-founded. Tuberculosis showed particular cruelty toward the young, whose developing immune systems struggled against the persistent bacteria. In tenement communities, it wasn't uncommon to lose multiple children to the disease once it found its way into a family. With the day's plans established, Margaret headed out into the already warm morning. The streets bustled with activity. Peddlers setting up carts, delivery wagons making their rounds, workers hurrying to various jobs. The air carried the mixed aromas of breakfast cooking, horses, factory smoke, and the ever-present undertone of inadequate sanitation. As she walked, Margaret passed evidence of the transforming city. A crew of men installed telephone lines along one block. A vacant lot from yesterday now hosted the beginnings of a new building's foundation. A recently opened shop displayed the latest mechanical innovations in its window: typewriters, phonographs, early cameras. The pace of change in 1880s urban America was disorienting, especially for immigrants who had come from places where life had remained essentially unchanged for generations. New technologies appeared almost weekly. Building projects transformed familiar landscapes overnight. Social patterns shifted as traditional cultures adapted to new realities. For someone like Margaret, who had grown up in rural Ireland, where seasons rather than hours dictated the rhythm of life, the constant acceleration required continual adjustment. Each day brought something that hadn't existed the day before. Each year made the previous one seem distant and quaint. Arriving at Mrs. Goldstein's workshop, Margaret found the usual hustle already in progress. 20 women bent over fabric, the air thick with lint, and the sound of scissors cutting, needles piercing material. Occasional instructions called across the room. "You've brought the extra work?" Mrs. Goldstein asked, examining the pieces Margaret handed over. "Good quality as usual. There's more if you want it. Henderson's has a rush order for children's pinafores." Margaret calculated quickly. More piecework meant more income, but also less sleep, more strain on her eyes, additional pressure on Sarah and her mother-in-law to contribute. The balance was never simple. How many pieces? At what rate? The negotiation was direct, without pretense. 15 pieces, 3 cents each, due Monday. It was a fair offer, slightly rushed but not impossibly so. 45 cents potential income, enough to make a meaningful difference in the family budget if they could complete all 15 pieces. I'll take them, Margaret decided, but I'll need the material today so we can start tonight. Mrs. Goldstein nodded. The arrangement settled without further discussion. This businesslike efficiency characterized many working relationships in immigrant communities. No time wasted on pleasantries when survival was at stake, but also a fundamental fairness born of shared struggle. The workday proceeded with the usual intensity. Margaret's fingers flew over fabric, her mind divided between the task at hand and the swirl of concerns waiting at home. Mrs. Kowalski's deteriorating condition, Daniel's labour meeting tonight, the extra piecework to complete, Thomas working longer hours to compensate for Daniel's potentially risky activism. At the workbench beside her, Rosa chattered intermittently, providing welcome distraction. "My cousin Esther met your Thomas last night. She thinks he's handsome." Margaret smiled despite herself. At 16, Thomas was indeed becoming a handsome young man, his features settling into a mature version of the boyish face she still saw when she looked at him. "She's the one just arrived from Poland. Seems a bit soon to be noticing handsome boys." Rosa laughed. "What else should she notice? Might as well be something pleasant in this new world." There was wisdom in the observation. For new immigrants especially, finding joy amid the overwhelming transition was a survival strategy as important as securing work or housing. The human spirit needed beauty and connection as surely as the body needed food and shelter. Midday brought a brief respite. 15 minutes to eat whatever they'd brought from home. Margaret unwrapped bread and a small piece of cheese, carefully measured to leave enough for tomorrow's lunch. Around her, the other women did the same, their meals varying based on cultural background and financial circumstances. "Did you hear about the factory fire in Philadelphia?" one of the women asked the group. "Textile mill, 7 dead, dozens injured. They say the doors were locked from the outside." The news sent a ripple of grim recognition through the women. They all understood the vulnerability of their position, working in crowded conditions surrounded by flammable materials, often in buildings with inadequate exits. Fire was the particular terror of garment workers, its possibility never far from their thoughts. "Henderson's keeps the back stairs clear," Mrs. Goldstein said defensively, as if the conversation were a personal accusation. "And we have the water barrel by the door." Her workshop was indeed safer than many, but the reassurance felt hollow against the reality of 7 dead workers in Philadelphia. Everyone in the room knew how quickly flames spread through fabric, how easily smoke overcame in enclosed spaces, how little value employers often placed on worker safety. The afternoon passed in concentrated work, hands moving almost independently of conscious thought as muscle memory took over. By 4 o'clock, Margaret's eyes burned from strain, and her neck ached from hours bent over the sewing table. But her quota was met, and the extra piecework for home was bundled securely in her basket. As the women prepared to leave, Mrs. Goldstein made an announcement. "Henderson's is expanding, taking the space next door. We'll need 5 more girls starting next month." The news rippled through the room. Expansion meant stability. Stability meant continued employment in the precarious economy of immigrant labour. This counted as significant good fortune. "Skilled girls only," Mrs. Goldstein continued. "Experience with fine stitching. Send any likely candidates my way." Margaret immediately thought of Mrs. Kowalski, who had worked as a seamstress before her illness made it impossible. Such cruel timing, opportunity arriving just as the ability to seize it departed. Still, perhaps there were others in the building who could benefit. She made mental notes of women to approach. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows between buildings. Margaret's path home took her past a newsboy calling out headlines from the evening edition. She scanned the small crowd gathered around him, hoping to spot Thomas, but he must be at another corner. The headline caught her attention. Labour unrest spreads. Railroad workers threaten nationwide strike. Her stomach tightened. Daniel's meeting tonight suddenly felt more dangerous, more potentially consequential. Labour activism in 1882 carried real risks, not just job loss, but violence from company-hired strikebreakers, police intervention, even federal troops in some disputes. The newsboy elaborated on his headline, spinning the facts into maximum drama to sell papers. Railroad barons hiring Pinkerton detectives, workers arming themselves, potential disruption to national commerce. Margaret continued walking, her mind working through implications. If the railroad struck, other industries might follow. If ironworkers joined, Daniel could lose his position. If widespread labour action occurred, the family's already tight circumstances could become desperate. Yet beneath the fear ran a contradictory current of hope. Working conditions needed improvement. Pay needed to reflect the value created by labour. Children needed protection from exploitation. Someone must stand for these principles, even at personal risk. The complexity of her feelings mirrored the complexity of the labour movement itself, both threatening and promising, destructive and constructive, frightening and inspiring. Like most working-class adults, Margaret understood that meaningful change rarely came without disruption. The question was always whether the potential gains justified the certain costs. Approaching the tenement, Margaret noticed unusual activity. A small crowd had gathered near the entrance, their attention focused on something inside the courtyard. Drawing closer, she saw what had attracted them. Jacob Rees, the photographer from last night, had set up his camera and was documenting daily life in the tenement. Currently his lens was aimed at women doing laundry in the shared courtyard facilities, massive tubs where they scrubbed clothing against washboards. The physical labour was evident in their postures. It was back-breaking work, especially in summer heat, but necessary given the impracticality of doing laundry in the tiny apartments upstairs. Margaret paused, observing Rees as he observed her community. His presence felt intrusive yet potentially useful. If his photographs brought attention to tenement conditions, perhaps improvements might follow. Yet, there was something uncomfortable about having your hardship transformed into images for others to consume without truly understanding the lives behind them. As if sensing her thoughts, Rees looked up and noticed her watching. "Good afternoon," he called. "I remember you from yesterday. Murphy family, 5th floor." Margaret was surprised he remembered such details after a brief interaction. "Yes, I'm documenting daily life here," he explained, gesturing to his camera. "These images will accompany articles about tenement conditions, perhaps eventually a book. And what good will that do us?" The question came out more directly than Margaret intended, but she didn't retract it. Rees seemed taken aback by her forthrightness. "Well, to create change, people must first understand the conditions. My photographs show what words alone cannot convey." It was a reasonable answer, but Margaret had heard similar promises before. Reporters came. Politicians occasionally visited during campaign seasons. Charity organisations conducted surveys. Yet the fundamental conditions remained unchanged. Too many people in too little space, paying too much rent for too few services, working too many hours for too little pay. "I hope you show the dignity as well as the difficulty," she said finally. "We may be poor, but we're not simply objects of pity." Rees studied her with new interest. "A fair point, Mrs. Murphy. I'll keep it in mind." With a nod, Margaret continued into the building. The stairwell was cooler than outside, a small mercy as she began the climb to the 5th floor. The familiar scents and sounds of the tenement greeted her. Aromas from various ethnic traditions, children playing on landings, multilingual conversations flowing from open doorways. On the 3rd floor landing, she encountered Mrs. Abramowitz coming down with a bundle of soiled linens from the Kowalski apartment. The older woman's face was grim. "Not good," she said simply. "The bleeding has started." Margaret crossed herself automatically. Bloody coughing was a near-final stage of consumption when the lungs began to disintegrate in earnest. "I'll come up after I check on Mother Murphy and Sarah." Mrs. Abramowitz nodded and continued downward with her burden. The community care network was fully activated now. Women taking turns sitting with Mrs. Kowalski, cleaning what needed cleaning, preparing what food might be acceptable to someone too ill to feel hunger. At her own apartment, Margaret found Sarah and Grandmother Murphy already preparing for the evening's work. The vegetables for soup simmered on the small stove. Clean laundry hung from a line strung across one corner of the room. The table was cleared for the piecework that would occupy their evening hours. "Thomas came home for a few minutes," Sarah reported. "Said he'd be late tonight too. Extra papers because of railroad strike news." Margaret nodded, unsurprised. Her son had a good head for business, understanding how to capitalize on public interest in breaking news. "And how is Mrs. Kowalski?" "Fading," Grandmother Murphy said bluntly. "Priest came this afternoon, last rites." The information landed heavily. Despite knowing Mrs. Kowalski's condition was grave, the finality of last rites made the approaching loss concrete. Another neighbour, soon to join the too-long list of tenement residents claimed by disease. Their absence marked by black crape on a door before life necessarily continued for everyone else. Sarah's expression reflected her struggle to process this adult reality of death. At 12, she was old enough to understand what was happening, but young enough to still be disturbed by its inevitability. "Will she go to heaven?" she asked the child's question, cutting through adult prevarication. "Of course she will," Grandmother Murphy answered without hesitation. "Suffering in this life is rewarded in the next. And who has suffered more patiently than Mrs. Kowalski? It was the tenement theology, a belief system adapted to make sense of disproportionate hardship. If this life was characterized by inequality and injustice, then surely the next must balance the scales. Without such faith, how could anyone continue day after day?" Margaret set down her basket containing the new piecework. "I'll go sit with her for a while. Start on these when you've eaten." As she crossed the hall to the Kowalski apartment, Margaret mentally prepared herself for what awaited. She was no stranger to sick rooms or death watches, having performed this neighbourly duty many times in both Ireland and America. Still, each vigil required its own gathering of strength, its own steeling against the intimate witnessing of another's pain. Inside, the Kowalski apartment mirrored the Murphys in layout, but felt entirely different in atmosphere. The heavy stillness of serious illness had transformed the space. The air smelled of sickness, attempted remedies, and the particular sweet-sour odour that accompanied late tuberculosis. Mrs. Kowalski lay on the bed, her once substantial frame now skeletal beneath a thin sheet, despite the summer heat. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, occasionally interrupted by weak coughing that produced pinkish phlegm. Mr. Kowalski sat beside her, his large workman's hand looking incongruously gentle, as it held her much smaller one. He looked up at Margaret's entrance, nodding acknowledgement but not speaking. Words had become superfluous in this room, where the most important conversation was now between his wife and God. Margaret moved quietly to the other side of the bed, taking up a position that allowed her to assist if needed without intruding on the couple's intimacy. From her apron pocket she produced a small rosary and began silently moving through the familiar prayers, the beads sliding through work-worn fingers. Through the open window came the sound of the city continuing its business. Carriage wheels on cobblestones, children playing, vendors calling their wares, factory whistles marking shift changes, life persisting in all its varieties. While in this small room, one particular life approached its conclusion. Time moved differently in a death vigil. Minutes stretched like hours, yet hours collapsed into moments. Margaret lost track of how long she'd been sitting beside Mrs. Kowalski. The rosary beads warm in her hand, prayers flowing without conscious thought. Mr. Kowalski hadn't moved, his large frame hunched protectively over his wife's diminished form. The room grew dimmer as evening approached, shadows lengthening across the worn floorboards. Neither of them moved to light a lamp. The darkness felt appropriate somehow, a gentle veil drawing across a life approaching its end. A soft knock at the door broke the stillness. Mrs. Abramowitz entered with a fresh, damp cloth, wordlessly taking the used one from the bedside table. She glanced at Mrs. Kowalski, crossed herself in the orthodox manner, and shared a look of understanding with Margaret before departing. These small gestures of community care continued throughout the evening. Women from various apartments bringing clean linens, broth that wouldn't be consumed, prayers in different languages but identical intent. The tenement functioned as a single organism in times of crisis, each cell performing its role without need for coordination. As darkness settled fully over the room, Mrs. Kowalski's breathing changed, becoming more irregular. Mr. Kowalski tensed, his hand tightening around his wife's. Margaret leaned forward slightly, recognizing the pattern from previous deathbeds she'd attended. "Hannah," Mr. Kowalski whispered, using his wife's first name, perhaps for the first time in Margaret's hearing. The intimacy of it felt almost intrusive to witness. Mrs. Kowalski's eyes fluttered open briefly, finding her husband's face in the dim light. Her lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear, but Mr. Kowalski nodded as if understanding. A final communication between partners who had shared the journey from old country to new, from youth to middle age, from hope to hardship, and back again. Then, with a soft exhale that sounded almost like relief, Mrs. Kowalski was gone. The laboured breathing stopped. The room grew profoundly still. Margaret murmured the final prayer for the dead, the words familiar from too many similar moments. Mr. Kowalski didn't move, still holding his wife's hand as if unwilling to acknowledge the severed connection. After allowing him a few minutes of private grief, Margaret rose quietly. "I'll tell the others," she said softly. "Take the time you need." He nodded without looking up. A man suddenly alone in a country where his language was still foreign, his customs strange, his place uncertain. The particular cruelty of immigrant death, passing away far from ancestral lands, traditional mourning practices adapted to new circumstances, burial in unfamiliar soil. In the hallway, Margaret encountered Sarah waiting anxiously. "Is she—" "Yes, love. She's at peace now." Margaret drew her daughter close, feeling the girl's slight frame against her own. "Run down and tell Mrs. Abramowitz. She'll know what needs doing." As Sarah hurried off on this solemn errand, Margaret returned to her own apartment. Grandmother Murphy looked up from her sewing, reading the news in her daughter-in-law's expression. "God rest her soul," the older woman said, making the sign of the cross. "Poor Kowalski, a widower in a strange land." "The women will organise everything," Margaret said, taking up her own piecework. "Funeral Society will handle the burial. Father Donovan will say Mass." This matter-of-fact approach to death might seem callous to modern sensibilities, but in the tenements, grief was a luxury few could afford for long. Life demanded continuation. Work couldn't wait for mourning to complete its course. The practical arrangements of death required immediate attention, even as emotional processing was necessarily delayed. The two women worked in silence for a while, their needles moving rhythmically through fabric. Outside, darkness had fully claimed the city, though night was a relative concept in tenement districts. The streets remained active with evening commerce, socializing, and the movements of those who worked night shifts in factories, theatres, and restaurants. "Did you eat?" Margaret asked, the practical question of motherhood. Sarah nodded. "Some soup. I saved plenty for you and Pa." The mention of Daniel reminded Margaret of his labour meeting tonight. She glanced at the small clock on the shelf. Nearly 8, and no sign of him or Thomas. 2 empty places at the table. 2 men in her life navigating the wider world with its opportunities and dangers. Imagine that for a second. Your husband's at a potentially dangerous labour meeting. Your teenage son is working late on city streets known for gang activity and violence. And you just have to keep sewing, keep functioning, keep the household running with no way to check on them, no way to know they're safe until they walk through the door. The women continued their work, the room quiet except for the occasional direction from Margaret about a particular stitch or design element. Though Sarah was only 12, her sewing skills were already considerable, a necessary accomplishment for working-class girls who would depend on such domestic abilities for both employment and household management. Around 9 o'clock the door opened to admit Thomas, his newspaper bag empty, but his expression troubled. "Everything sold," he reported, placing his earnings on the table for the family accounting. "People buying multiple copies of the evening edition. Railroad strike news has everyone talking." "Your father?" Margaret asked. "Haven't seen him." Thomas helped himself to the soup kept warm on the stove. "There's police all over the east side tonight, watching workers gathering places." Margaret's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their steady rhythm. Police presence near labour discussions often signalled potential conflict. Management informing on worker meetings. Authorities preparing to intervene if talk turned to action. "Mrs. Kowalski?" Thomas asked, noticing the unusual quiet in the building where news of death would normally trigger more visible activity. "Gone about an hour ago," Grandmother Murphy answered. "Women are with her now. Funeral likely day after tomorrow, depending on when the society can arrange it." Thomas nodded, processing this expected but still impactful news. Death was a familiar visitor in the tenements, but familiarity didn't negate its effect, just altered how it was expressed and accommodated. "Mr. Kowalski will need help with rent now," he observed practically. "Maybe some of us men could contribute a few cents each week." This suggestion, coming from a 16-year-old, demonstrated how thoroughly tenement children absorb the community ethics of mutual support. No formal instruction needed, They learned by watching adults create systems of reciprocal aid that made survival possible. The evening continued with work and subdued conversation. Margaret shared news from the garment workshop, the expansion, the potential jobs. Thomas described fragments of conversations he overheard while selling papers, speculation about the railroad strike, rumours of potential federal intervention, debates about the labour movement's growing power. Through it all, they maintained awareness of Daniel's continued absence. No one mentioned worry directly, but it manifested in Margaret's occasional glances toward the door, in Thomas's slightly distracted responses, in Grandmother Murphy's more frequent prayers. Around 10 o'clock, activity increased in the hallway. People coming and going from the Kowalski apartment. Murmured conversations, practical arrangements being made, the tenement's death protocols in action, a choreography developed through necessity and repetition. "I should help," Margaret said, setting aside her sewing. Death duties were primarily women's domain in most immigrant cultures. The washing and dressing of the body, the preparation of the apartment for visitors, the organisation of food for mourners. "I'll finish this piece first," Grandmother Murphy said, indicating the nearly completed shirtwaist in her hands. "Then I'll help too." Margaret crossed the hall, entering the transformed Kowalski apartment. Women from throughout the building moved with quiet efficiency, performing tasks according to unspoken assignments. Mrs. Abramowitz and an Italian woman from the second floor washed Mrs. Kowalski's body. 2 Polish women prepared traditional foods in the small kitchen area. Others cleaned the apartment, arranged furniture to accommodate visitors, placed religious items appropriately. Mr. Kowalski sat in a corner, simultaneously central to and separate from these activities. Custom dictated his non-participation in this women's work, yet his presence was essential, the chief mourner, the anchor for the rituals being enacted. Margaret joined the work naturally, taking up the task of sewing a simple shroud. The fabric, plain white cotton, had appeared as if by magic, contributed from someone's limited stores. This too was part of the tenement support system. Materials manifesting when needed, their source often anonymous, the giving as matter-of-fact as the receiving. As the women worked, they shared stories about Mrs. Kowalski, her exceptional strudel, her kindness to new building residents, her beautiful singing voice before the illness took hold. This informal eulogy, spoken in a blend of languages with translations offered as needed, constructed a communal memory that would persist after individual recollections fade. "She helped me when my Yakov was born," Mrs. Finkelstein recalled. "Sat with me 3 nights when the labour wouldn't progress. Knew exactly what to do when the midwife gave up. Taught my girls to make proper pierogi," Mrs. Wazinski added. "Said every woman should know her homeland's food, even in America." "Remember how she decorated her window at Christmas," Mrs. O'Brien contributed. "Paper stars she cut herself. So delicate. Made the whole courtyard view nicer." These testimonials, offered while hands remained busy with practical tasks, represented the tenement version of formal memorial services. No printed programs, no written obituaries, just the oral tradition of remembrance passing woman to woman, building to building, eventually becoming part of the collective memory of the neighbourhood. Around 11, a disturbance from the street drew attention. Raised voices, running footsteps, the distinctive sound of police whistles. The women paused in their work, exchanging concerned glances. "The labour meeting, maybe," Mrs. Abramowitz suggested quietly. "My Boris said there was one tonight near Tompkins Square." Margaret moved to the window, straining to see into the darkness below. The street lanterns provided insufficient illumination to identify individuals, but she could make out a group of men hurrying past, followed at some distance by police officers. Her stomach tightened with familiar anxiety. Daniel could be among those men, potentially identified by police as a labour organiser or agitator. The consequences could range from minor, a night in jail, a warning, to severe, loss of employment, blacklisting, even deportation in extreme cases. She returned to her work, hands steady despite her inner turmoil. This too was part of tenement life, maintaining outward functionality while internally processing fears too numerous to acknowledge openly. The ability to compartmentalize, to continue necessary tasks while uncertainty loomed, represented a crucial survival skill for immigrant women especially. The next hour passed in continued preparation of Mrs. Kowalski's body and apartment. More neighbours arrived to pay respects, some bringing small food offerings despite their own limited resources. Mr. Kowalski received these visits with dignified gratitude, his grief temporarily structured by the formal rituals of death. Shortly after midnight, Margaret heard familiar footsteps on the stairs. Daniel's distinctive tread, slower than usual, perhaps indicative of exhaustion or injury. She excused herself from the Kowalski apartment and stepped into the hallway just as her husband reached their landing. In the dim light, she could see that his clothing was dishevelled and there was a darkening bruise on his cheekbone. He looked simultaneously defeated and defiant, a combination she'd seen before in moments of significant setback. "You're hurt," she said simply. "It's nothing." He glanced toward the Kowalski apartment, noting the unusual activity. "Mrs. Kowalski," Margaret murmured. "About 3 hours ago. Peaceful at the end." Daniel nodded, processing this expected news. "Poor Kowalski, we should help with expenses." "Already being arranged." Margaret studied her husband's face, reading the signs of whatever transpired tonight. "The meeting?" Daniel shook his head slightly, indicating this isn't the place for that discussion. Too many ears, too many potential informants, even among sympathetic neighbours. Labour talk remained dangerous territory, especially after some kind of confrontation had clearly occurred. They entered their apartment to find Thomas waking up despite the late hour, his expression relieving slightly at the sight of his father. Grandmother Murphy had fallen asleep in her chair, her unfinished sewing still in her lap. Sarah's small form was curled on her pallet, though Margaret suspected she was awake and listening. "You should have been sleeping hours ago," Daniel told his son, the gentle reprimand carrying no real force. "Wanted to make sure you got home all right," Thomas responded, his eyes taking in his father's dishevelled appearance and bruised face. "Heard there was trouble near Tompkins Square." Daniel moved to the water basin, washing his face and hands before speaking again. The familiar ritual seemed to help him transition from whatever occurred outside to the relative safety of home. "Meeting was productive until the end," he said finally, his voice low. "Good turnout. Representatives from 5 factories, discussion of reasonable demands, 10-hour day, safer conditions, fair payment schedules." He paused, checking that Sarah appeared asleep before continuing. Then someone, a plant from management probably, started talking about property damage, sabotage. Police were waiting outside, seemed like they knew exactly when to move in. The familiar pattern of labour suppression in the 1880s, infiltration of meetings, provocation toward more radical action, police intervention justified by threats to public order. The system well designed to undermine legitimate organising efforts. "Anyone arrested?" Thomas asked. "Some. I got away in the confusion. Others weren't so lucky." Daniel's expression darkened. "Fitzgerald from my department was taken. Has 3 children and a wife expecting another." The name hung in the air. Fitzgerald, the man who lost 3 fingers recently and received no compensation. His arrest likely meant termination from the iron works, potential blacklisting from other factories, a family suddenly without income. "We'll help them," Margaret said simply. Just as the tenement community mobilised for illness and death, it would respond to this different kind of crisis. Food would appear at the Fitzgerald door. Children would be looked after while Mrs. Fitzgerald sought whatever work she could find in her condition. Men would make inquiries about potential jobs at factories without blacklisting connections. Daniel nodded, accepting this as given. Then, with clear reluctance, he shared the most consequential news. Harrison was there himself, saw me clearly. The implication was immediate and severe. Mr. Harrison, the ironworks owner, personally witnessing Daniel at a labour meeting, almost certainly meant termination, possibly as soon as tomorrow. The family's primary income source now in jeopardy. Margaret absorbed this information without visible reaction, her mind already calculating adjustments. Which expenses could be eliminated? Which possessions might be sold? Which additional work opportunities might be pursued? This rapid adaptation to changing circumstances, this refusal to waste energy on recrimination or despair, characterized immigrant resilience in the face of constant precarity. "I've been thinking," Thomas said into the heavy silence. "O'Malley mentioned the shipping office is hiring down at the harbour, loading manifests, keeping track of cargo. They want someone who can write clearly and do figures." The suggestion carried multiple implications. Thomas had been considering more stable employment than newspaper selling. He'd been making inquiries without mentioning them to his parents. He was prepared to take on more financial responsibility if his father lost his position. At 16, he was thinking with the strategic planning of an adult provider. Daniel studied his son, recognizing the maturity behind the casual suggestion. Office work. With your schooling, you could qualify. Pays not as good as the iron works, Thomas acknowledged, but it's steady and inside work. Not so hard on the body. The unspoken comparison hung between them. The contrast between Daniel's physically demanding labour with its toll visible in his calloused hands and numerous small burns, and the potential for Thomas to earn a living through clerical skills rather than physical exertion. Something to consider, Daniel said finally, but not tonight, too late for such discussions. The family prepared for sleep, moving through their evening routine with the efficiency born of limited space and long practice. Daniel checked on Sarah, confirming she was genuinely asleep now, her breathing deep and regular. Margaret helped Grandmother Murphy from her chair to her sleeping place. Thomas arranged his pallet near the door. As they settled into their respective sleeping spots, the sounds of the tenement at night surrounded them. Distant conversations, a baby crying several floors below, the creak of the building settling, occasional footsteps in the hallway as the activities around Mrs. Kowalski's death continued through the night. Daniel lay awake despite his evident exhaustion, staring at the ceiling barely visible in the darkness. Margaret could sense his wakefulness, the tension in his body revealing the thoughts cycling through his mind, concern about potential job loss, calculation of family needs, consideration of limited options, weighing of principles against pragmatism. "Sleep," she whispered, reaching across the small space between them to touch his arm. "Tomorrow will come regardless." His hand found hers, squeezing gently in acknowledgement. This simple contact, this physical affirmation of partnership carried more meaning than extended conversation. They'd weathered crises before. They would weather this one too, whatever form it took. Gradually Daniel's breathing deepened as sleep claimed him despite his worries. Margaret remained awake a while longer, her mind moving methodically through contingency plans. If Daniel lost his position, Thomas might pursue the shipping office job. She could seek more hours at the garment workshop when it expanded next month. Sarah was young but capable of taking on additional piecework at home. Grandmother Murphy's arthritis was worse, but she could still manage some contribution to family income. They would survive. Not comfortably, not easily, but they would continue. This certainty, this fundamental faith in their collective capacity to endure, underlay all other considerations. It wasn't optimism exactly, more a hard-earned confidence in their ability to adapt, to sacrifice, to find paths forward when obstacles arose. As midnight passed into early morning, the tenement gradually quieted. The women completing Mrs. Kowalski's preparation departed for their own apartments. The street noises diminished as even the night workers and revellers sought rest. For a few precious hours, the relentless pace of tenement life slowed, allowing its exhausted residents brief respite before dawn arrived to begin the cycle anew. Margaret finally surrendered to sleep, her last conscious thoughts not of tomorrow's potential hardships, but of the shipping office job Thomas mentioned. Office work, clean, respectable employment using mind rather than muscle, a first step toward the better future that brought them to America in the first place. This ultimately was the immigrant dream, not personal advancement necessarily, but the opening of doors for the next generation. The chance for children to climb higher than their parents could, to have choices beyond mere survival. Even in the darkest moments, this dream sustained them, providing purpose to hardship and meaning to sacrifice. Outside, the night watchman called the hour. 2 o'clock and all is well. The irony of the traditional call went unremarked in the sleeping tenement. All was not well. Not with Mrs. Kowalski lying dead across the hall. Not with Daniel facing likely termination. Not with thousands of families crowded into unsafe buildings, working dangerous jobs, living constantly on the edge of disaster. Yet in another sense, perhaps the watchman spoke a deeper truth, in the connection between neighbours supporting each other through crisis, in the dignity maintained despite undignified conditions, in the small acts of kindness and community that made survival possible, in the stubborn hope that propelled people forward despite overwhelming evidence for despair. For the Murphy family and countless others like them, this paradox defined life in 1880s America, a simultaneous recognition of profound injustice alongside persistent faith in potential improvement, the ability to see clearly the harsh realities of their circumstances without surrendering to them, the courage to continue building something meaningful within systems designed to extract maximum labour for minimum compensation. As the Murphys slept, the city continued its restless evolution around them. New telegraph lines being installed, electrical systems expanding, railroads pushing ever westward, industrial innovations emerging from countless workshops and laboratories, the machinery of progress grinding forward, powered by the labour of those who benefited from it least. Yet even in sleep, the Murphys remained part of this transformation, not just as cogs in its mechanisms, but as conscious participants, shaping its direction through their daily choices, their community bonds, their insistence on dignity, their quiet but determined resistance to dehumanization. In this way, while seemingly powerless individually, collectively, they helped determine what kind of nation America would become, its values, its social structures, its definition of community and responsibility. Their impact extended far beyond their awareness, influencing a future they could barely imagine, but nonetheless helped create. Morning arrived too soon, grey light seeping through the small window before the family was ready to face what this day might bring. Daniel woke first, the habitual timing of years at the ironworks embedded in his body despite the short night's sleep. For a moment he lay still, watching the familiar cracks in the ceiling, mentally preparing for what was likely waiting at the factory gates. Margaret stirred beside him, immediately alert as was her custom. Their eyes met in the dim light, a world of unspoken communication passing between them. No need for words, both understood exactly what this day represented. "I'll go in as usual," Daniel said quietly. "Better to face it directly than wait for them to send someone." Margaret nodded. Dignity mattered, especially when little else remained under your control. "We'll manage. Either way." Such simple words to encompass such complicated reality. "We'll manage." The working-class mantra that contained within it all the strategizing, sacrificing, and sheer determination required to survive when systems were designed for your exploitation rather than your flourishing. Around them, the tenement began its daily awakening. The familiar sounds of neighbours preparing for another day of labour. Footsteps on the stairs, water being pumped in the courtyard, children being roused from sleep, the collective stirring of hundreds of people whose labour powered the city's prosperity, while they themselves remained on its margins. The Murphy morning routine unfolded with practiced efficiency, each person performing their role in the careful choreography of shared space. Thomas dressed quickly for his paper route, adding the shipping office to his day's agenda. Sarah rekindled the small fire in the stove for tea. Grandmother Murphy said her morning prayers from her chair. Daniel and Margaret prepared for their respective workplaces, though both suspected Daniel's preparation may prove unnecessary. Before they dispersed for the day, the family paused for a moment around the small table, sharing tea and bread in near silence. This brief communion, this moment of togetherness, before facing individual challenges, served as both practical nourishment and symbolic affirmation of their interdependence. "I'll walk with you part way," Thomas told his father as they prepared to leave. It was an unusual offer. Their routes typically diverged immediately, and everyone understood its significance. Thomas wanted to be present to witness whatever happened at the ironworks, to stand with his father in this moment of vulnerability. Daniel hesitated, then nodded acceptance. The gesture acknowledged something important. Thomas was no longer simply a child to be protected from harsh realities, but increasingly a partner in the family's navigation of those realities. As father and son departed, Margaret turned to the day's tasks with intensified focus. If Daniel lost his position, every penny became even more precious. The extra piecework must be completed perfectly. Additional opportunities must be sought. Resources must be stretched further than seemed possible. "I'll help Sarah with the laundry today," Grandmother Murphy offered, sensing Margaret's preoccupation. "My hands aren't too bad this morning." "And I can take over the mending," Sarah added. "You showed me how to patch trouser knees properly last week." These offers, these small redistributions of labour, represented the family's immediate adaptation to crisis. No discussion needed, no elaborate planning, just the automatic rebalancing of responsibilities to address changing circumstances. Outside, Daniel and Thomas walked through streets already busy with morning activity. Neither spoke much, both absorbed in their thoughts about what awaited at the ironworks. The factory's chimneys were visible from blocks away, black smoke signalling another day of production, regardless of individual workers' fates. As they approached the gates, they saw an unusual figure waiting. Mr. Sullivan, the foreman from Daniel's department, standing apart from the entering workers. His presence outside rather than at his usual position, overseeing the shift start-up, confirmed Daniel's suspicions. This was indeed a termination. "You should go now," Daniel told Thomas quietly. "No need for you to witness this." Thomas hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave his father facing this moment alone. "The shipping office," Daniel reminded him. "That's where you're needed today for the family." This framing, placing Thomas's job-seeking in the context of family responsibility, gave the boy permission to leave. With a quick squeeze of his father's shoulder, Thomas continued down the street, glancing back once before turning the corner toward the harbour. Daniel approached Mr. Sullivan with deliberate dignity, his back straight despite the fatigue of too little sleep and the anticipated humiliation of public dismissal. "Murphy," Sullivan nodded, his expression revealing discomfort with his assigned task. "Mr. Harrison wants to see you." This was unexpected. Terminations typically happened at the gate, not in the owner's office. The deviation from standard procedure introduced uncertainty into what had seemed a foregone conclusion. "Now?" Daniel asked. "Now?" Sullivan gestured toward the administrative building adjacent to the main factory. "I'm to bring you directly." They walked in silence through the ironworks yard, passing workers who averted their eyes, recognizing the situation but unwilling to acknowledge it directly. Being singled out by management rarely led to positive outcomes. The administrative building presented a stark contrast to the factory floor. Quiet, relatively clean, the air breathable rather than choked with smoke and metal dust. Sullivan led Daniel to a secretary's desk outside Harrison's office. "Daniel Murphy to see Mr. Harrison," he informed the young man seated there, then turned to Daniel. "Good luck," he said quietly before departing, returning to his proper domain on the factory floor. The secretary disappeared into the inner office, returning moments later. "Mr. Harrison will see you now." Daniel entered the owner's office with the same dignity he'd maintained throughout this process, determined to face whatever came without revealing vulnerability. The room was luxuriously appointed by the standards of the time. Polished wooden desk, leather chairs, oriental carpet, large windows offering natural light that workers on the factory floor rarely experienced. Harrison himself stood near these windows looking out at the factory yard. He was a man in his 50s, his clothing and bearing marking him as unmistakably upper class. He turned as Daniel entered, studying him with clinical interest. "Murphy," he said, consulting a paper on his desk. "Ironworker, Department 3, 5 years with us." "Yes, sir." Daniel stood with his cap in his hands, neither servile nor defiant. Harrison circled his desk, maintaining the physical advantage of his position. "You were at Tompkins Square last night." It wasn't a question, so Daniel didn't treat it as one. He simply waited for whatever came next. "Labour agitation," Harrison continued, "union talk, demands for changes to established systems." Again, not directly questioning. So Daniel remained silent. This approach, neither confirming nor denying, neither apologising nor justifying, represented a small but meaningful retention of personal dignity in a profoundly unequal power dynamic. Harrison studied him, perhaps expecting protestation or explanation. Receiving neither, he changed tactics. "Do you know what these machines cost, Murphy?" The investment represented by this facility, the financial risk undertaken to create these jobs. "No, sir." Simple truth. Workers were given no insight into the financial structures underlying their employment. "Millions," Harrison said emphatically. "Millions of dollars, thousands of calculations, countless hours of planning, creating something from nothing, building an industry that never existed before." He was warming to his topic now, clearly accustomed to having his perspective received without challenge. And yet workers who risk nothing, who invest nothing, who simply perform the tasks they're hired to do, believe they should dictate terms. The fundamental divide of industrial capitalism laid bare. Capital viewing labour as merely one production input to be optimised for efficiency. Labour viewing itself as the essential component deserving fair compensation and conditions. Two perspectives so fundamentally different that meaningful dialogue rarely occurred. Harrison returned to his desk, picking up a different document. "Your foreman reports you're skilled, reliable, rarely absent, quick to learn new processes." This shift in focus caught Daniel by surprise, though his expression revealed nothing. The company is expanding, Harrison continued. New facilities being constructed across the river, modern equipment, additional capacity to meet increasing demand. He looked up from the document. We need experienced men to train the new workers, men who understand the processes thoroughly. Daniel began to see where this conversation was heading, though he hardly dared believe it. I'm offering you a position, Harrison stated. Assistant foreman at the new facility. Slightly higher pay, responsibility for training and supervising a team of 15 men. The unexpected turn rendered Daniel momentarily speechless. Promotion rather than termination, advancement rather than punishment. It made no sense given what transpired at Tompkins Square. Harrison seemed to read his confusion. Don't misunderstand, Murphy. I saw you at that meeting. I know your sympathies, but I also know skilled workers when I see them, and business requires practical decisions, not merely ideological ones. He leaned forward slightly. The position comes with conditions, of course. No union activities, no labour organising, no participation in strikes or work stoppages, your complete loyalty to company interests. One violation, and termination will be immediate and permanent. And there it was. Not generosity, but strategy. Not recognition of Daniel's worth, but calculation of his potential utility. The offer represented sophisticated labour management rather than genuine opportunity. Co-optation rather than advancement. The classic technique of separating potential leaders from the rank and file by offering them minor privileges. I need your answer today, Harrison concluded. The new facility begins operations next week. Daniel considered the offer, weighing multiple factors simultaneously. The slightly higher pay would ease the family's constant financial pressure. The supervisory position would mean less physical strain, potentially extending his working years. The location across the river would remove him from his current co-workers, isolating him from the community building around labour organising. Most significantly, accepting meant compromising his growing belief in workers' right to collective action. It meant abandoning Fitzgerald and others arrested last night. It meant choosing individual benefit over group solidarity. May I have until tomorrow morning to decide? Daniel asked, his first substantive response in the conversation. Harrison studied him, then nodded once. Tomorrow at 7 o'clock, here in this office. After that, the offer is withdrawn. Thank you, sir. Daniel placed his cap back on his head, a small gesture reclaiming his identity as a working man rather than a supplicant. I'll return with my answer then. As he exited the administrative building, Daniel felt the eyes of workers on him, curiosity and concern in their glances. Word had likely spread that he was called to Harrison's office, rather than simply dismissed at the gate. Speculation would be rampant. He walked through the factory yard and out the main entrance, his mind already working through the implications of Harrison's offer. The day stretched before him. Unexpected free hours when he would normally be operating machinery. An opportunity to consider options, to consult with Margaret, to make a decision that would affect not just his employment, but his place within the working-class community. Across town, Thomas approached the shipping office near the harbour. The smell of salt water and maritime commerce filled the air. The building was modest, but substantially more formal than the newspaper distribution centre where he normally began his day. Through the windows he could see men in shirt sleeves working at high desks, recording information in large ledgers. Thomas straightened his collar, wishing he had better clothes for this inquiry. The shipping office represented a different world than newspaper selling or factory work, a clerical environment where appearance and education mattered more than physical capability. His 3 years of schooling, supplemented by consistent self-education through newspaper reading and borrowed books, would be tested here. Inside, he approached a counter where an older man with spectacles reviewed documents. "Excuse me, sir. I heard you might be hiring for record-keeping positions." The man looked up, assessing Thomas with practiced efficiency. "Age?" 16, sir. "Education?" 3 years formal schooling. "I can read, write, and calculate well. I've been handling money and inventory as a newspaper seller for 4 years." The man's expression revealed nothing. "Experience with shipping documentation?" "No, sir, but I learn quickly." A pause as the man considered. Thomas maintained eye contact, projecting a confidence he didn't entirely feel. This moment, this small interaction, could represent a crucial pivot point for his family's future. "We need someone for the afternoon shift," the man said finally. 4 a.m. to midnight. Recording incoming cargo, matching against manifests, starting pay $3 weekly. $3 weekly, less than his father made at the ironworks, but more than Thomas earned selling newspapers, regular indoor work, potential for advancement based on performance rather than physical endurance, a foot in the door of clerical employment. "When could I start?" Thomas asked, his voice steady despite his internal excitement. "Tomorrow. Come at 3:30 for training." The man slid a form across the counter. "Fill this out. Bring it with you. Don't be late." "I won't be. Thank you, sir." Thomas took the form, carefully folding it into his pocket. The interaction had lasted less than 5 minutes, but represented a significant step toward a different future than his father had known. As he exited the shipping office, Thomas couldn't suppress a smile of accomplishment. Wait until he told his parents. Wait until his father heard that his son would work indoors with papers rather than molten metal, using his mind more than his muscles. This was why they came to America, for possibilities that simply didn't exist in Ireland, for doors that might open, however slightly, to the next generation. At the Tenement, activity centred on the Kowalski apartment where neighbours came continuously to pay respects. Margaret divided her time between her own family's needs and the community obligation to support Mr. Kowalski. Sarah had taken on additional household responsibilities, her young face serious with the weight of adult concerns. When Daniel arrived home unexpectedly early, Margaret's first reaction was resignation. The anticipated termination had occurred, but his expression conveyed something more complicated than simple job loss. "Harrison offered me a position," he told her once they had a moment of privacy in their apartment. "Assistant foreman at the new facility, slightly better pay." Margaret absorbed this unexpected news, immediately understanding the complexities behind such an offer. Conditions of no union involvement, complete loyalty to the company. Daniel sat heavily at the small table, the weight of the decision evident in his posture. "I have until tomorrow morning to accept." They discussed the offer from all angles, practical, ethical, strategic, the financial benefits versus the compromise of principles, the potential advancement versus the abandonment of co-workers, the immediate security versus the long-term implications. Their conversation, conducted in low voices while Sarah helped neighbours prepare food for mourners, demonstrated the partnership at the core of their marriage, joint decision-making on matters affecting the family's future. By mid-afternoon, Thomas returned with his own news, proudly displaying the employment form from the shipping office. $3 weekly to start, indoor work recording cargo, potential to learn the shipping business. The family gathered around the table to examine this unexpected development, recognizing its significance. If Thomas secured this position, it changed the calculation regarding Daniel's offer. The combined income, Daniel's ironworks pay plus Thomas's shipping office salary, would create breathing room in the perpetually tight family budget. It might even allow for Sarah to return to school for a year or two, improving her future prospects as well. "My son," the office worker, Daniel said with genuine pride, any potential resentment about Thomas's different path completely absent. With a pen rather than a hammer. This moment, this quiet celebration of generational advancement, captured the essence of the immigrant journey. Not the sudden transformation from rags to riches portrayed in sensationalist success stories, but the incremental improvement from one generation to the next, the gradual opening of doors previously closed, the slow accumulation of possibilities. Evening brought the official wake for Mrs. Kowalski. The building's residents gathered in and around the small apartment, bringing food despite their own limited resources, offering comfort through presence rather than platitudes. The formal rituals of death, candles, prayers, shared memories, provided structure for grief that might otherwise be overwhelming. Daniel and Margaret participated fully in these community observances while continuing their private deliberation about Harrison's offer. The wake itself, with its demonstration of mutual support among people of different backgrounds united by common struggle, seemed to influence Daniel's thinking. The sight of Fitzgerald's wife among the mourners, her face showing the strain of uncertainty following her husband's arrest, weighed particularly heavily. As midnight approached, the Murphy family returned to their apartment, physically and emotionally exhausted from the day's events. Tomorrow brought Mrs. Kowalski's funeral in the morning, Daniel's deadline with Harrison, and Thomas's first day at the shipping office, a convergence of endings and beginnings, closures and opportunities. In the quiet darkness of their room, Daniel finally articulated his decision to Margaret. "I can't take Harrison's offer. Not with Fitzgerald arrested. Not with conditions as they are." Margaret didn't express surprise. She'd known her husband's likely choice from the moment he described the offer, understanding that his sense of solidarity would ultimately outweigh practical considerations. "Thomas's new position will help," she said, "and I can take additional piecework." Morning arrived with thin light filtering through the window. The family prepared for Mrs. Kowalski's funeral, donning their best clothes, kept carefully preserved for such occasions despite their age and wear. They joined neighbours in the solemn procession to the small church where Father Donovan would say Mass for the departed. The funeral represented tenement solidarity at its most visible. Dozens of people from various backgrounds, speaking different languages, practicing different versions of Christianity, united in supporting Mr. Kowalski and honouring his wife's memory. The garment workshop women attended together, Mrs. Goldstein having given them the morning off without pay deduction, a rare acknowledgement of community need from business interests. After the service, Daniel separated from the burial procession, heading instead toward the ironworks for his appointment with Harrison. He walked with the dignity that had characterized his approach throughout this situation, neither apologetic nor confrontational, simply clear in his principles. In Harrison's office, the exchange was brief. Daniel declined the offer with simple directness, offering no elaborate justification. Harrison's expression revealed irritation but not surprise, as if he expected this outcome despite hoping otherwise. "You're choosing poorly, Murphy," he said, a hint of genuine puzzlement in his tone. "Your family would benefit from this position." "Yes, sir," Daniel acknowledged, "but some costs are too high." Harrison studied him for a moment longer, then dismissed him with a wave. "We'll send your final pay to your address. That will be all." Daniel exited the administrative building for the last time, crossing the factory yard where he'd spent 5 years of his life. The massive machinery continued its operation, indifferent to individual departures. The industrial process absorbed and replaced workers with minimal disruption. The human component designed to be interchangeable, disposable. Yet, as Daniel passed through the gates, several workers nodded to him slightly, small gestures acknowledging his choice, recognizing its meaning within their shared context. News travelled quickly in factory environments. His decision would be known by midday, adding in some small way to the growing awareness of solidarity that management feared. He walked with no particular destination, allowing himself this unusual freedom of unstructured time. Eventually his steps led him toward the East River, where construction on the Brooklyn Bridge neared completion. The massive stone towers and the elegant curve of suspension cables created a silhouette against the sky that seemed to embody both human ambition and actual achievement. Daniel stood among other observers watching workers move across the nearly completed span, so many individual efforts combining to create something that would outlast all of them, so many unknown names contributing to a structure that would become an iconic symbol of the city and the era. In some ways, it mirrored the larger project of America itself, millions of individual stories, including the Murphys, weaving together into a national narrative more complex and contradictory than any single perspective can capture. The exploitation and the opportunity, the hardship and the possibility, the corruption and the idealism, all coexisting, all true simultaneously. As evening approached, Daniel made his way home, joining his family for a simple meal before Thomas departed for his first shift at the shipping office. The boy looked transformed in his clean shirt and carefully combed hair, excitement and nervousness visible in equal measure. "You'll do well," Daniel told him at the door, "and remember everything, learn the systems, make yourself indispensable." Thomas nodded, absorbing this advice from a father whose own work experience had been so different from the path he was beginning. "I'll make you proud," he promised. "You already have," Daniel assured him, the simple truth requiring no elaboration. As darkness fell, the Murphy apartment settled into evening quiet. Sarah completed her lessons under Grandmother Murphy's supervision. Margaret worked on the final pieces of piecework due tomorrow. Daniel read the newspaper Thomas brought home, scanning employment notices while considering options. They didn't discuss the challenges ahead, the tight margins that would become tighter, the additional work that would be necessary, the adjustments required to compensate for Daniel's job loss. Those practical concerns would come tomorrow. Tonight was for simply being together, finding strength in their connection to each other and to the community around them. Outside, the city continued its evolution. Telegraph lines carrying messages at unprecedented speed, electric lights beginning to replace gas in wealthier districts, factories producing through the night, construction reshaping the urban landscape, new immigrants arriving daily to join the great experiment. Inside, the Murphy family represented both the cost and the purpose of this transformation, the human core beneath the statistical accounts of industrial output and economic growth. Their story, multiplied by millions, formed the foundation of modern America. Not presidents or millionaires, but ordinary people navigating extraordinary change with resilience, dignity, and hope for those who would come after them. The morning after Daniel's decision, the air in the Murphy tenement room was heavy with unspoken questions. No factory whistle for Daniel today. Instead, he would join the ranks of the unemployed, at least temporarily. Yet there was a quiet resolve in the family. Margaret moved with purpose, ensuring everyone had a full stomach before facing the day. Thomas, with a new spring in his step, prepared for his first shift at the shipping office. Sarah, ever observant, busied herself with tasks trying to ease the burden on her parents. "Thomas, remember what your father said," Margaret advised, smoothing his collar. "Be diligent, show them you're worth more than $3 a week." "I will, Ma," Thomas replied, his young face earnest. He felt the weight of new responsibility, but also the thrill of opportunity. This was his chance to step up, to prove his worth in a different world. He glanced at his father, a silent understanding passing between them. Daniel had made his choice, and Thomas would honour it by striving for their future. Daniel, meanwhile, helped Grandmother Murphy to her chair, his movements deliberate. "I'll go to the docks today," he announced. "There's always work, loading and unloading, even if it's not steady." It was back-breaking labour, often paid by the hour or by the load with no guarantee of daily employment, but it was honest work, and it was available. Margaret nodded. "And I'll take the additional pinafore work. We'll manage." Her tone was firm, a testament to her unyielding spirit. The family had faced hardship before, and they would face this too. As Daniel and Thomas left, the quiet in the apartment settled in a new way. Sarah, usually eager to run errands, felt a heightened sense of her role. She helped Grandmother Murphy sort fabric scraps, her small hands moving with a newfound seriousness. The community's grief over Mrs. Kowalski was still palpable, but life, as always, continued its relentless march. Daniel arrived at the docks, a chaotic symphony of shouting men, creaking ropes, and the splash of water against wooden pilings. Ships from across the world lined the piers, disgorging their varied cargo. The air was thick with the smell of brine, spices, and sweat. He joined the clusters of men waiting for a foreman to call out for workers, his eyes scanning for familiar faces, for any sign of an opportunity. The work was brutal. Heavy sacks of grain, crates of manufactured goods, barrels of oil, all had to be moved by hand, often up rickety gangplanks or into the holds of ships. By midday, Daniel's back ached, and his muscles screamed in protest. The pay was a pittance compared to the ironworks, but it was enough to buy a few basic necessities. He felt the sting of his decision, the immediate financial setback, but also a quiet pride in his refusal to compromise his principles. Meanwhile, Thomas navigated the bustling streets towards the shipping office. The experience was a stark contrast to his newspaper route. Here, the pace was less frantic, the noise more subdued, the air cleaner. He presented his completed form to the man with spectacles, who assigned him a high desk and a stack of manifests. Thomas spent the afternoon meticulously recording cargo, his mind absorbing the intricate details of trade and logistics. It was challenging, requiring concentration and precision, but it was also engaging in a way that selling newspapers never had been. He felt a different kind of exhaustion at the end of his shift, mental fatigue rather than physical, but also a sense of accomplishment. Margaret at Mrs. Goldstein's workshop worked with renewed intensity. The pinafores were delicate, requiring fine stitching, but her experienced hands moved with speed and accuracy. The news of Daniel's dismissal and Thomas's new job had spread among the women, eliciting murmurs of sympathy and admiration. Rosa, ever the confidant, expressed her concern. "He'll find something better, Margaret. He's a good man." "He always does," Margaret affirmed, her eyes focused on her needle. She trusted Daniel's resilience, his ability to provide. Their marriage was a partnership of endurance, each supporting the other through life's relentless currents. That evening, the family gathered, sharing their day's experiences. Daniel spoke of the docks, the camaraderie among the longshoremen, the sheer physical demands. Thomas, with a touch of youthful enthusiasm, described the shipping office, the ledgers, the manifests, the fascinating world of global commerce. Margaret recounted the progress on the pinafores, the news of the garment district. They pooled their meagre earnings, a little less than before, but enough to hold them for a few more days. "We'll manage," Margaret repeated, her gaze sweeping over her family. It was more than a phrase. It was a promise, a declaration of their unwavering resolve. The weeks that followed settled into a new, demanding rhythm for the Murphys. Daniel continued to find work at the docks, but it was sporadic and unpredictable. Some days he'd earn enough for a decent meal, other days barely enough for bread. He often came home with aching muscles and a weariness that went deeper than physical fatigue, a quiet frustration with the precariousness of their existence. His old department at the ironworks was still abuzz with news of his refusal of Harrison's offer. Some workers admired his stand, seeing him as a man of principle. Others, more pragmatic, viewed him with a mixture of pity and bewilderment. "Foolish pride," some muttered, "when a family needs to eat." But for Daniel, the choice felt clear. He couldn't betray Fitzgerald and the others, couldn't turn his back on the budding hope of a union. Thomas, meanwhile, thrived at the shipping office. His diligence and quick learning quickly earned him the respect of his superiors. He began to understand the complex systems of global trade, the routes of ships, the flow of goods that fueled the city's prosperity. He saved diligently, putting aside a portion of his $3 weekly wage, dreaming of further education, perhaps even a business of his own someday. He still did his paper route in the mornings, waking even earlier, his days stretching long and full. His path was diverging sharply from his father's, a symbol of the new opportunities that America offered to those with education and ambition. Sarah, too, was growing. With Margaret often busy with piecework late into the night, Sarah took on more responsibility for managing the household and caring for Grandmother Murphy. She continued her quiet studies, practicing her letters with the slate pencil Thomas had given her, sometimes reading aloud from the tattered school books Thomas brought home. Her dreams were less grand than Thomas's, but no less fervent. A clean home, enough food, and perhaps a small room of her own someday, a space where light could reach and the air was fresh. The tenement community, still mourning Mrs. Kowalski, pulled together. Mr. Kowalski, though heartbroken, found solace in the support of his neighbours. Women brought him meals, men helped him with small repairs, and the children often kept him company. The communal spirit was a lifeline, a shared humanity that transcended the harshness of their environment. Jacob Rees, the photographer, continued his work in the Lower East Side. His presence was becoming more common, and while many residents still viewed him with suspicion, a few, like Margaret, began to see the potential for his work to bring about change. His flashes of magnesium powder at night, illuminating the darkest corners of the tenements, became a familiar, if startling, sight. He was capturing the raw, unvarnished truth of their lives, and perhaps, just perhaps, those images would speak to the consciences of the powerful. One evening, as Daniel returned from the docks, he passed a small, dimly lit hall near Tompkins Square. A few men lingered outside, their voices low and urgent. He recognized some faces from the ironworks, men who, like him, had been radicalized by the increasing exploitation and dangers of factory life. They nodded to him, a silent invitation. He hesitated for a moment, then walked inside. The room was sparsely furnished, a few benches, a small table, a single gas lamp casting flickering shadows. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of desperation mixed with defiance. Fitzgerald, the man arrested at the last meeting, was there, his arm still bandaged, his face pale but resolute. His wife, newly pregnant, had managed to secure some sewing work, but their situation was dire. "Daniel, you've come," Fitzgerald greeted him, his eyes holding a mix of gratitude and challenge. "We need good men, men who won't bow to Harrison's threats." The meeting was small, but the discussions were passionate. They talked about the abuses of the company store, where workers were forced to buy supplies at inflated prices. They spoke of the lack of safety, the constant fear of injury, the absence of any recourse for those who were maimed or killed. They debated strategies, quiet negotiation, public appeals, and the ultimate, most dangerous weapon, the strike. Daniel listened, his heart heavy but also stirred. He saw in their faces the same struggles, the same burning desire for dignity that fueled his own choices. He knew the risks. He had felt the lash of unemployment, but he also knew that silence and individual endurance alone would never change anything. Collective action, even at great personal cost, was their only hope. He spoke briefly, his voice steady. He recounted his meeting with Harrison, the offer of promotion, the conditions. A hush fell over the room. His refusal resonated deeply, a powerful testament to his commitment. "He tried to buy me," Daniel said, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "He can't buy all of us." His words ignited a spark. The men began to speak with renewed vigour, sharing stories, strategizing. They knew the path would be long and dangerous, but in that small, smoky room, a fragile sense of unity began to take root. Sarah's mornings began earlier now, long before the sun had fully chased away the shadows from the tenement alleys. With her father working sporadic hours at the docks, and her mother often hunched over piecework late into the night, Sarah had assumed a new mantle of responsibility. She stoked the small stove, heated water for washing, and helped Grandmother Murphy get settled in her chair, her small frame moving with a quiet efficiency that belied her 12 years. Her most cherished possession was the slate pencil Thomas had given her. In the brief lulls between chores, while the laundry was boiling in the shared courtyard tubs, or during Grandmother Murphy's afternoon nap, Sarah would carefully open Thomas's discarded schoolbooks. She devoured the lessons he had left behind, painstakingly copying letters and numbers onto her small slate, her tongue often sticking out in concentration. Thomas, noticing her hunger for knowledge, would sometimes quiz her in the evenings, explaining concepts he had learned years ago, now refreshed by his own newfound intellectual pursuits at the shipping office. One afternoon, while running an errand for her mother to a small fabric store on Allen Street, Sarah lingered by a bookstall. Unlike the sensationalist dime novels Thomas sold, these books were different, worn copies of classics, science texts, and histories. She spotted a thin, unassuming volume with a faded cover, Lives of Remarkable Women. Curiosity piqued, she tentatively picked it up. Inside, she found stories of women who had defied expectations, inventors, writers, activists. It was a world she had never imagined, a world beyond the tenements and factory floors. The bookseller, a kindly old man with wire-rimmed spectacles, noticed her interest. "A penny a day to read, little one," he offered, seeing the longing in her eyes. "Bring it back when you're done." It was an extravagance, but one Sarah couldn't resist. Each evening after her chores were done and her family settled for sleep, she would steal precious minutes by the dim gaslight, losing herself in the tales of these extraordinary women. She learned about Ada Lovelace, who had envisioned machine intelligence, and Harriet Tubman, who had guided slaves to freedom. These stories, read in the flickering light of her cramped tenement room, fueled a secret fire within her, a quiet understanding that her life too might hold more possibilities than she could yet see. The rhythms of the city continued around them, a grand, grinding machine. Daniel's work at the docks was a testament to the raw, physical power that built America. He saw the world from the waterline, a constant flow of goods and people connecting New York to distant lands. He learned to distinguish the subtle calls of different ship captains, the telltale creaks of overloaded cargo nets, the faces of men from every corner of the globe, Irish, Italian, German, Chinese, African American, all united by the common struggle for a day's wage. One sweltering afternoon, while unloading a heavy shipment of textiles, Daniel witnessed a confrontation. A group of men, desperate for work, tried to rush a gangplank before the foreman had officially called for hands. A scuffle broke out, quickly escalating. Daniel instinctively stepped in to de-escalate, his years of experience with factory conflicts giving him a measured authority. He managed to separate the men, preventing a full-blown riot, but not before drawing the attention of a stern-faced dock manager. Later, the manager approached him. "You handled that well, Murphy. You got a head on your shoulders. You ever thought about being a gang boss?" The offer was unexpected, reminiscent of Harrison's offer, but different. A gang boss at the docks was still a working man, just one with a little more authority, responsible for a small crew. It was a step up from casual labour, offering more steady work, albeit with the same inherent dangers of the docks. Daniel thanked the manager, promising to consider it. The choices continued to present themselves, each one a test of his principles, a weighing of personal gain against collective good. Meanwhile, Thomas's world at the shipping office expanded daily. He was quickly promoted from merely recording manifests to assisting in the coordination of smaller shipments. Learning the subtle art of negotiation with draymen and warehouse managers, he saw the city from a different perspective now, a vast network of commerce, a web of transactions and logistics. He frequented the public library during his lunch breaks, devouring books on economics and business, his ambition growing with each new piece of knowledge. He often shared his insights with Daniel in the evenings, talking about market forces, supply and demand, concepts that seemed abstract but were, in fact, the invisible hand guiding their very lives. "The money's in information, Pa," Thomas would say, his eyes gleaming. "Knowing where things are going, who needs what, when, not just muscle." Daniel would listen, his calloused hands a stark contrast to Thomas's clean fingers. He saw the truth in his son's words, even as he felt the old world of physical labour slipping away, being replaced by a new world of ledgers and ideas. He worried for Thomas, for the pressures of this new ambition, but also felt a fierce pride. His son was reaching for something beyond the factory gates, something he himself had never dared to dream of. The summer slowly gave way to autumn. The air in the tenements grew crisper, and the need for coal became more urgent. The Murphys, like countless other families, braced for the colder months, a time when illness spread more rapidly and the struggle for warmth was as constant as the struggle for food. The small, close-knit community continued to be their bedrock, a source of comfort and aid in a city that often felt indifferent to their plight. The cooler autumn air brought with it a different kind of chill, a growing tension in the industrial districts. The whispers of labour unrest had solidified into organised movements, and the railroad strike, which had simmered for weeks, finally erupted. Nationwide, trains ground to a halt. In New York, the docks became even more frantic, as goods diverted from rail traffic poured in, creating a temporary boom for longshoremen, but also a breeding ground for discontent. Daniel, while grateful for the steadier work at the docks, found himself caught between two worlds. The dock workers, a diverse and often volatile group, were also beginning to organise. The foreman's offer of a gang boss position still weighed on his mind, a tempting escape from the physical grind, but one that came with the implicit price of loyalty to management. His commitment to the larger labour movement, ignited by Fitzgerald's arrest and the brutal conditions he witnessed daily, was unwavering. He attended every union meeting he could, often late into the night after a gruelling day at the docks. The small hall near Tompkins Square buzzed with a new energy. Men from various trades, longshoremen, factory workers, garment cutters, shared their grievances, their stories of exploitation, their dreams of a fairer world. Fitzgerald, released on bail, had become a powerful, if physically diminished, voice for the movement. His missing fingers were a constant, stark reminder of the cost of industrial labour. He spoke passionately about the need for a national union, a unified front against the power of the corporations. Daniel, initially a quiet observer, found his own voice emerging, his measured words carrying the weight of his experience and the respect he commanded among his peers. Meanwhile, Margaret found herself drawn into a different kind of organising. The garment workshop, buoyed by the expanding Henderson's order, was hiring more women. But the expansion also brought increased pressure and speed-ups. The talk of a union among the garment workers, which Rosa had mentioned weeks ago, was now more urgent. Fires, like the one in Philadelphia, served as grim reminders of their vulnerability. One afternoon, a young, fiery woman named Clara Lemlich arrived at Mrs. Goldstein's shop. She was a seasoned organiser, her small frame belying a fierce determination. She spoke directly to the women, her Yiddish fluent and her English laced with a passionate urgency. She talked about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, already notorious for its unsafe conditions, and how its workers, mostly young immigrant women, were on the verge of striking. She urged Mrs. Goldstein's workers to join them, to demand better wages, shorter hours, and most importantly, locked doors to be opened. Margaret listened, her heart pounding. The risks were immense. Losing their jobs meant immediate destitution. But the stories Clara told, the vivid descriptions of women burned alive because they couldn't escape, resonated deeply. Margaret remembered Mrs. Kowalski's cough, the constant fear of illness, the daily struggle for dignity. She looked at Rosa, at Esther, at the other women, their faces a mixture of fear and growing resolve. She spoke up, her voice clear in the hushed workshop. "We cannot stand by while our sisters burn. My husband, he faces the same dangers. We must fight." Her words, coming from a respected older woman, carried significant weight. A ripple of agreement spread through the room. Thomas, in his new role at the shipping office, was also witnessing the labour unrest firsthand, but from a different vantage point. The port was a hive of activity, but underlying it was a sense of barely suppressed chaos. Longshoremen, emboldened by the railroad strike, occasionally refused to unload cargo from companies known for anti-union practices. Managers, stressed and overworked, struggled to keep the flow of goods moving. Thomas, as a clerk, was privy to the anxieties of the merchants and the directives from the company owners, orders to break the strikes, to hire new, cheaper labour, to use force if necessary. He saw the raw power of capital, its determination to protect profits at all costs. But he also saw the growing power of organised labour, its ability to disrupt, to demand, to challenge the established order. He wrestled with his own ambitions. His job offered stability, a path to a better life for his family. But his father's principles, Margaret's courage, the suffering he saw daily in the tenements, these things pulled at him, a silent conflict of loyalty and self-interest. Sarah, meanwhile, continued her secret education, now adding newspaper clippings about the strikes to her collection of remarkable women. She understood, in her own child's way, that her father and mother were involved in something important, something dangerous. The lessons from her books, of courage, of justice, seemed to echo the real-world struggles of her parents. She started writing short stories in her slate notebook, tales of tenement heroes and heroines, fighting for a better world. Her young imagination was already a canvas for social change. The railroad strike escalated, creating a ripple effect across New York's industries. The docks, already under pressure, saw a surge in longshoremen's union activity. Daniel found himself at the forefront of organising efforts among his fellow workers. He knew the risks. Harrison's warning still echoed in his mind. But the plight of Fitzgerald, the conversations in the Tompkins Square Hall, the raw injustice he witnessed daily, these solidified his resolve. One cold morning, after a particularly impassioned meeting, the longshoremen at Daniel's Pier voted to strike in solidarity with the railroad workers and to demand better pay and safer conditions for themselves. The foreman, a gruff but fair man named O'Connell, looked at Daniel with a mixture of respect and regret. "You know what this means, Murphy. They'll bring in the scabs and the Pinkertons." Daniel nodded. He knew. Striking meant an immediate cessation of income, a direct threat to his family's survival. It meant confrontation, potentially violence. But the alternative, continued exploitation, a life without dignity, was no longer an option he could stomach. The next day the pier was eerily quiet. The ships remained docked, their cargo untouched. Men stood in groups, some resolute, others anxious. Soon a line of wagons pulled up, carrying replacement workers, poor, desperate men from other parts of the city, some immigrants, some former farmers, all driven by hunger to cross the picket line. Behind them, a contingent of armed Pinkerton agents, notorious for their brutality, took up positions, their presence a chilling promise of violence. A standoff ensued. Shouting matches turned into shoves, then punches. Rocks were thrown. The air filled with tension and fear. Daniel, remembering his de-escalation efforts on the docks previously, tried to keep the peace, urging his fellow workers to maintain discipline, to avoid giving the Pinkertons an excuse to open fire. But the raw emotion of the moment was difficult to control. Meanwhile, Margaret's world was also on the brink. Clara Lemlish's organising efforts had galvanised the garment workers. The women at Mrs. Goldstein's shop, emboldened by Margaret's support, joined the wider strike. On a freezing morning, they walked out of the workshop, their sewing machines silent behind them, joining hundreds of other women from various garment factories. Their picket lines were vibrant, a mix of defiance and desperate hope, songs and speeches echoing through the streets. Mrs. Goldstein, caught between her own meagre profits and the demands of Mrs. Henderson, felt the pressure intensely. She respected Margaret, but the strike threatened her livelihood. "I cannot pay more, Margaret," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Henderson will take her business elsewhere." Margaret's heart ached for Mrs. Goldstein, a fellow immigrant struggling to survive. but she also knew that individual compromise would lead nowhere. "We are asking for enough to live, Mrs. Goldstein, for safety, for dignity. These are not luxuries." The garment strike, though less violent than the railroad and dock strikes, faced its own challenges. Police often arrested women on picket lines for disorderly conduct. Strikebreakers, mostly women from even more desperate circumstances, were brought in. Margaret found herself facing down young women just like Sarah, their eyes hollow with hunger, forced to choose between starvation and betraying their sisters. It was a heartbreaking moral dilemma, a constant reminder of the brutal realities of their shared poverty. Thomas, at the shipping office, found himself in a particularly uncomfortable position. His work directly supported the efforts to break the strikes. He saw manifests for goods being rerouted, orders for new, cheaper labour being placed, reports of police actions against striking workers. He heard the casual, dismissive comments from his superiors about ignorant labourers and troublemakers. His conscience gnawed at him. He was earning steady money, learning a valuable trade, contributing significantly to his family's income. This was the path to success, the American dream his parents had hoped for him, but it felt tainted. He thought of his father on the picket lines, his mother facing down strikebreakers. He saw the suffering his work indirectly perpetuated. One day he overheard his boss discussing a particularly sensitive shipment, a large order of finished garments from a factory known for its harsh, anti-union stance, destined for a major department store that had publicly condemned the garment strike. The shipment was being expedited, a deliberate move to undermine the striking workers. Thomas saw a small detail on the manifest, a discrepancy in the routing, a vulnerability that could delay the shipment significantly, without directly involving him in sabotage. He wrestled with the decision. Should he reveal this information to his father, to the union? It would put his job, his future, at severe risk, but it might also help his mother, his community. It was a test of his own burgeoning principles, a choice between personal advancement and collective justice. That evening Thomas returned home, his face unusually grim. He found Daniel nursing a bruised arm, a minor skirmish on the picket line. Margaret was exhausted, her hands still trembling from a day of confrontations. Sarah was reading a newspaper article about the strikes, her brow furrowed with concern. Thomas sat them down, his voice low, and revealed what he had learned about the garment shipment. A heavy silence fell over the room. Daniel looked at his son, a profound understanding in his eyes. Thomas had chosen. He had chosen principle, even at personal cost. "It's dangerous, son," Daniel said, his voice husky. "You could lose everything." "I know, Pa," Thomas replied, his gaze steady. "But what good is everything if we have to step on others to get it?" Margaret, her eyes welling with tears, reached across the table and squeezed Thomas's hand. "You are your father's son." Thomas's information about the garment shipment was a game-changer. Daniel immediately relayed it to Fitzgerald, who, despite his injuries, understood the strategic importance. A delayed shipment meant financial pressure on the anti-union factory and the department store, a crucial leverage point for the striking garment workers. The plan was devised quickly and carefully. Daniel, using his knowledge of dock operations, coordinated with a small, trusted group of longshoremen sympathetic to the garment workers' cause. They would discreetly misplace key-loading manifests, creating enough confusion and delay to stall the shipment without risking direct confrontation or sabotage that could be easily traced back to the Union. It was a delicate operation, requiring precision and secrecy. The night of the planned action was tense. Daniel, after a long day on the picket line, joined his small crew at the docks. The air was thick with fog, a natural cover for their clandestine movements. Every shadow seemed to hold a Pinkerton agent. Every creak of the planks sounded like an approaching foreman. With practiced movements, they navigated the labyrinthine warehouses, subtly altering manifests, rerouting labels, and creating just enough bureaucratic chaos to ensure the shipment would sit untouched for days, if not weeks. As he worked, Daniel thought of Thomas, likely at home waiting nervously. He thought of Margaret, whose tireless efforts on the garment picket lines were now directly supported by this action. He thought of Sarah, whose quiet reading of remarkable women was now being lived out in the struggles of her own family. He felt a profound connection to them, a shared purpose that transcended the physical dangers of the moment. The operation was successful. The next morning, the garment factory's expedited shipment was a tangle of misplaced paperwork and rerouted crates, frustrating managers and delaying its arrival at the department store. The news spread like wildfire among the striking garment workers, a much-needed morale boost. It showed that collective action, even subtle, could yield results. Margaret, hearing the news at her picket line, felt a surge of defiant hope. However, the victory was not without its costs. The dock management, furious at the unexpected delays, tightened security and began questioning workers. Daniel, though careful, knew he was under scrutiny. The small acts of defiance, the whispers of solidarity carried a heavy price. Meanwhile, the railroad strike began to falter. Federal troops were eventually called in to break the strike, a stark demonstration of the government's willingness to side with capital. Many railroad workers, facing starvation and violence, were forced to return to work, their union broken, their demands unmet. The defeat sent a wave of despair through the wider labour movement, a painful reminder of the immense power they faced. Daniel, witnessing the railroad strike's collapse, felt a deep sense of discouragement. Had his own sacrifices been in vain? Would their small victories be crushed by the overwhelming forces of industry and government? He saw the faces of his fellow longshoremen, their initial resolve now tinged with fear and uncertainty. The offer of gang boss, of steady work and a small measure of authority, began to whisper to him again, a siren song of safety in a perilous world. But then he would look at Thomas, diligently studying his shipping ledgers, his face alight with a new understanding of the world. He would see Margaret, organising women on the picket lines, her voice hoarse but determined. He would see Sarah, her small hands turning the pages of her borrowed books, her mind alight with dreams of a different future, and in their unwavering resolve he found his own strength renewed. One evening, as the garment strike continued its slow, grinding battle, Thomas brought home a startling piece of news. He had seen Jacob Rees, the photographer, at the shipping office. Rees was interviewing clerks, asking about the impact of the strikes on commerce, the human cost of the industrial disruption. He had mentioned the delayed garment shipment, intrigued by the mysterious delays. Thomas had managed to steer Rees away from any specific details that could incriminate Daniel or the longshoreman. But the interaction sparked an idea. "Pa," Thomas said, "Rees is looking for stories, for ways to show people the truth. What if we told him about Fitzgerald, about the conditions at the ironworks, not just the strike, but the everyday dangers, the lack of safety?" Daniel considered this. Rees's photographs had already begun to generate discussion, even in wealthier circles. Perhaps the truth, unflinchingly portrayed, could be another weapon in their arsenal. It was a different kind of fight, a battle for public opinion, for the hearts and minds of those who lived far from the grime and danger of the tenements. "It's risky," Daniel said, his gaze fixed on the flickering gaslight. "Harrison will know it's me. He'll blacklist me from every factory in the city." "But it could help others, Pa," Sarah interjected, her small voice earnest. "If people know, they might do something." Margaret, who had listened in silence, nodded slowly. "She's right, Daniel. There's power in truth, even if it costs us. We have faced worse." Daniel looked at his family, at their faces etched with the realities of their lives, yet alight with an indomitable spirit. He had made his choice regarding Harrison's offer, and he would not regret it. Now, another choice presented itself, a choice that might not bring immediate relief, but could perhaps lay the groundwork for a future where no man had to choose between his family's survival and his own dignity. "All right," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Thomas, you find Rees. Tell him everything. Tell him the story of the ironworks. Tell him the story of Fitzgerald. Tell him the story of the Murphys." Thomas found Jacob Rees a few days later, lingering outside a police station, notebook in hand, observing the steady flow of arrests related to the ongoing strikes. Rees, a man with a keen eye for detail and a restless spirit, was intrigued by Thomas's mature demeanour and his direct approach. "Mr. Rees," Thomas began, "my father, Daniel Murphy, worked at the ironworks. He has a story to tell, a story about what life is really like for the men who build this city." Rees, accustomed to suspicion and evasion from tenement residents, raised an eyebrow. "A story? Many men have stories, son." "This one is different," Thomas insisted. "It's about a man who chose principle over promotion, about a man who saw his friend lose fingers and another arrested for simply asking for a fair wage." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And it's about the dangers no one sees, the ones that kill men slowly, every day. Reese's journalistic instincts were piqued. He agreed to meet Daniel that evening. The meeting took place in the Murphys' cramped tenement room, the gaslight casting long dancing shadows. Daniel, initially hesitant, slowly opened up, his voice steady as he recounted the grinding toil, the ever-present dangers, the company store's abuses, Fitzgerald's injury and arrest, and Harrison's cynical offer. Margaret and Grandmother Murphy sat silently, their presence a powerful testament to Daniel's words. Sarah, hidden in a corner, listened intently, her small heart swelling with pride and fear. Reese listened, scribbling furiously in his notebook. He saw not just a man recounting his hardships, but a man of profound dignity and moral clarity. He asked about the factory's interior, the heat, the noise, the lack of safety. He pressed for details, the specifics that would make the story visceral, undeniable. "And you refused the foreman's position?" Reese asked, his gaze fixed on Daniel. "Yes, sir, I couldn't abandon my fellow workers, not after all we'd seen." Reese nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "May I? May I photograph the iron works, and perhaps some of the men who work there?" Daniel considered this. It was a bold request, one that would almost certainly lead to his permanent blacklisting if word got out that he had facilitated Reese's entry. But he remembered Sarah's words. If people know, they might do something. He thought of the unseen suffering, the silent deaths. "Yes," Daniel said, his voice firm, "but you must show the truth, show the dangers, show what it costs." Reese, a man of his word, arranged a clandestine visit to the ironworks a few nights later, guided by Daniel and a few trusted longshoremen. Under the cloak of darkness, and with the connivance of sympathetic night shift workers, Reese captured a series of photographs that would shock the city. Images of men bathed in the orange glow of furnaces, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, their bodies contorted in postures of immense strain. Pictures of unguarded machinery, of sparks flying dangerously close to bare skin, of the grim reality of industrial labour. He also photographed Fitzgerald's hand, the 3 missing fingers a stark, visceral symbol of the human cost of unregulated industry. And in a daring move, he managed to photograph Harrison's opulent office, a stark contrast to the hellish conditions of the factory floor. These photographs, combined with Daniel's narrative and Reese's own impassioned prose, became part of a powerful series of articles published in a prominent New York newspaper. The impact was immediate and profound. Many middle and upper-class New Yorkers, who had always viewed the city's prosperity as a natural outcome of progress, were confronted with the grim reality of its foundations. The images were undeniable, the stories heart-wrenching. Harrison was furious. The articles sparked public outrage and, more importantly, drew the attention of city officials and burgeoning reform movements. While Harrison's attempts to identify Reese's sources were met with a wall of silence from the workers, Daniel knew his days at the docks were numbered. His blacklisting was now almost certain. But the articles also brought a surge of public sympathy for the striking garment workers. Clara Lemlich and Margaret used the momentum, distributing copies of the newspaper at their picket lines, showing the photographs, amplifying their demands for safer conditions and fair wages. The public pressure began to mount, forcing Mrs. Henderson and other manufacturers to reconsider their intransigence. Thomas at the shipping office observed the whirlwind of public opinion and the shifting tides of power. He saw how information, carefully presented, could become a weapon, how images could stir consciences, how truth, even ugly truth, could force change. His own ambition shifted slightly. It wasn't just about making money anymore. It was about understanding the levers of power, the forces that shape society, and how, even from the margins, one could subtly influence them. Sarah, reading the newspaper articles with wide, serious eyes, felt a profound sense of purpose. Her father, the quiet, principled man, was now a voice for the voiceless, his story echoing through the city. Her mother, the tireless seamstress, was a leader, fighting for her sisters. The remarkable women in her books were no longer distant heroes. They were her own family, living out their courage in the harsh reality of the tenements. She began to write her own observations in a small hidden notebook, recording the details of her life, the lives around her, a nascent journalist documenting her own changing world. The Murphys, in their own quiet way, were becoming part of the unseen force that was slowly, painstakingly pushing America towards a more just future. The publication of Jacob Riis's articles and photographs created a seismic shift in public discourse. The grim realities of the iron works, exposed in stark detail, forced many New Yorkers to confront the hidden costs of their industrial prosperity. Public sentiment, initially indifferent or even hostile to the striking workers, began to swing. For Daniel, the repercussions were swift. While Riis protected his sources, Harrison was not a man to be trifled with. The dock manager, under pressure, quietly informed Daniel that his services would no longer be required. The blacklisting was subtle but effective. Every foreman at every major dock in the city seemed to have received a silent directive: no work for Murphy. Daniel faced this setback with a quiet resignation. He had anticipated it, and his principles remained intact. The struggle was larger than his personal employment. Still, the weight of unemployment, the immediate threat to his family's income, was a heavy burden. He spent his days tirelessly searching for work, walking miles to smaller independent docks, offering his services for odd jobs, his once steady hands now occasionally idle. He even considered venturing out of the city, to construction sites further afield, but the thought of leaving his family, particularly during such uncertain times, was unbearable. Meanwhile, the pressure on the garment manufacturers began to yield results. The combination of public outcry, persistent picket lines, and the delayed Henderson shipment finally forced a compromise. Mrs. Henderson and other major manufacturers agreed to some of the union's demands: a 54-hour work week, down from 60 or more, slightly higher piece rates, and crucially, an agreement to keep factory doors unlocked during working hours. It was not a complete victory, but it was a significant step, a hard-won acknowledgement of the workers' power. Margaret returned to Mrs. Goldstein's workshop with a sense of guarded triumph. The conditions were still far from ideal, but there was a tangible improvement, a flicker of hope that things could indeed get better. The women, though exhausted, celebrated their collective achievement. Clara Lemlich, the fiery organizer, hailed it as a testament to the power of solidarity. Margaret, seeing the renewed determination in the eyes of her fellow seamstresses, felt a profound sense of purpose. Her sacrifice, Daniel's stand, it had all contributed to this moment. Thomas's position at the shipping office became even more critical for the Murphy family's survival. His $3 weekly wage, combined with Margaret's increased piecework earnings, became their primary lifeline. He continued to excel, his mind sharp, his ambition growing. He witnessed firsthand the intricate dance of supply and demand, the subtle shifts in markets, the power of information. He also saw how corruption intertwined with commerce, the backroom deals, the bribes, the exploitation that fueled the city's engine. His education was not just from books, but from the raw, unvarnished realities of the city's economic underbelly. One afternoon, a senior clerk, a cynical but intelligent man named Mr. Finch, took Thomas aside. "You're a smart lad, Murphy. You got a good head for figures, but you're too honest. This city runs on connections, on knowing who to pay and when. You want to get ahead, you got to learn the game." He offered Thomas a small, seemingly innocuous task, slightly misrepresenting the weight of a shipment for a favoured merchant, allowing them to pay less duty. It was a test, a subtle invitation into the murky world of informal commerce. Thomas, remembering Daniel's principles, politely declined, citing a mistake in his calculations. Mr. Finch simply chuckled, shaking his head. "Suit yourself, lad, but opportunities don't knock twice for the principled." Thomas felt the sting of the missed opportunity, but also a renewed sense of integrity. Sarah, meanwhile, found an unexpected outlet for her growing intellect. Father Donovan, impressed by her diligence and the stories he heard of her self-education, offered her a small job at the parish, helping to organise the church's meagre library and assisting with basic literacy classes for newly arrived immigrants. It was a volunteer position, offering no pay, but it provided Sarah with access to more books, a quiet place to read, and a sense of contributing to her community. She taught basic English and reading to women and children, finding immense satisfaction in helping others unlock the power of words. She would often share her insights with Grandmother Murphy, who, though illiterate, possessed a deep wisdom honed by years of observation. The winter months brought new challenges. Coal was expensive and food became scarcer. Illness, particularly colds and influenza, swept through the tenements, taxing already weakened bodies. The Murphys, like their neighbours, relied heavily on their community network. Meals were shared, medicines, often homemade remedies, were passed around, and comfort was offered in moments of despair. Mr. Kowalski, still grieving, became a quieter fixture in their lives, his presence a poignant reminder of loss, but also of resilience. Daniel, despite his continued unemployment, found a new purpose in the burgeoning reform movements. He joined community groups advocating for improved sanitation, better housing codes, and public health initiatives. He spoke at meetings, his voice now confident and articulate, drawing on his personal experiences to advocate for change. He worked alongside Jacob Rees on some projects, helping to identify particularly egregious tenement conditions for documentation. He was no longer just a worker, but an activist, a leader in his own right, fighting for a different kind of progress. One bitter cold evening, a fire broke out in a nearby tenement, fueled by a faulty stove and flimsy construction. The narrow streets hindered the fire wagons, and panic spread through the crowded building. Daniel, hearing the commotion, rushed to the scene. He helped guide residents to safety, his strength and calm presence invaluable in the chaos. He worked alongside firefighters, breaking down doors, carrying children, his heart aching with the familiar spectre of tenement tragedy. He saw firsthand the devastating impact of the conditions he fought against, but also the incredible courage and selflessness of ordinary people in the face of disaster. The experience further solidified his commitment to the cause of reform, reminding him that the fight for dignity was not just about wages, but about life itself. Thomas, now a regular fixture at the shipping office, was slowly climbing the ladder. He had impressed Mr. Henderson, the department store owner, not Margaret's patron, but a relative, with his keen mind and meticulous record-keeping. He was being entrusted with more complex tasks, including reconciling larger invoices and occasionally drafting correspondence. His earnings had increased to $4 weekly, a significant sum for their family. He even managed to put aside a small amount each week into a secret savings account, a tangible symbol of his progress and his dreams. However, his quiet ambition was constantly challenged by the stark realities of his family and community. The persistent hardship Daniel faced, the blacklisting that prevented him from finding steady work, the ongoing struggles of the tenement residents, these were never far from Thomas's mind. The comfort of his indoor work, the cleanliness of his hands, felt almost like a betrayal when he saw his father return home from the docks, weary and bruised, or heard of another neighbour succumbing to consumption. One particular day, Mr. Finch, the cynical senior clerk who had once offered Thomas a shortcut, approached him with a new proposition. "Murphy, I've got a little side venture, nothing illegal, mind you, just efficient, a way to move certain goods through customs with less scrutiny. It involves some creative paperwork, a few well-placed errors. Your skill with ledgers would be invaluable, and the compensation, well, it would be significantly more than your current wages, enough to put your family in a proper flat out of this god-forsaken tenement." The offer was tempting. A proper flat. The words echoed in Thomas's mind. A place with running water, maybe even an indoor toilet, a room for Sarah, a comfortable bed for his grandmother. It was everything he dreamed of for them, the tangible proof of his success. He knew it wasn't outright illegal, but it skirted the edges of ethics, relying on subtle deception and exploiting loopholes. It was the game Mr. Finch had spoken of, the grey area where ambition often thrived in this city. He spent the rest of the day wrestling with the decision. He thought of his father's unwavering principles, his mother's quiet strength, Sarah's innocent trust. He thought of the words of Clara Lemlich, of Fitzgerald's missing fingers. Could he truly achieve a better life for his family by compromising the very values they embodied? He knew his father would never approve. But was his father's idealism practical in a world that rewarded cunning as much as honesty? Meanwhile, Sarah, immersed in her new role at the parish library, was discovering the power of empathy through literature. She read stories to newly arrived immigrant children, tales of courage and kindness, often translating them into rudimentary Italian or Yiddish for those who struggled with English. She saw their wide, hopeful eyes, their struggles to learn a new language, to adapt to a bewildering new world. She realized that her own family's story, while unique, was also a universal one, a shared narrative of displacement, struggle, and resilience. One day, a young Polish girl, Esther, Rosa Abramowitz's cousin, whom Thomas had charmed with his penny trick, came to Sarah for help. Esther's family, new to the city, was struggling terribly. Her father, a skilled carpenter in Poland, could only find work as a day labourer, and her mother was ill. They faced eviction, and Esther, though only 10, was desperate. She had heard Sarah could read and write, and timidly asked if Sarah could help her write a letter to a distant relative in Chicago, pleading for assistance. Sarah, though overwhelmed by the girl's plight, agreed. She carefully penned the letter, her slate pencil scratching across a precious piece of paper, pouring all her burgeoning writing skills into conveying Esther's family's desperation. As she wrote, she understood more deeply the power of words, not just for learning, but for connecting, for seeking help, for giving voice to the voiceless. She felt a profound sense of responsibility, a direct connection between her quiet studies and the urgent needs of her community. That evening, Thomas returned home, the offer from Mr. Finch still heavy on his mind. He saw Sarah, her face serious, explaining to Grandmother Murphy about Esther's family. He listened as she described their poverty, their fear of eviction. He saw the genuine compassion in her eyes, the way she mirrored his grandmother's quiet concern. The image of Sarah, so young yet so deeply engaged with the suffering of another, hit Thomas with a force that far outweighed the allure of Mr. Finch's offer. He realized that the proper flat, the personal advancement, would be hollow if it came at the expense of his own integrity, if it meant turning his back on the very community that had sustained them. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm. "I told Mr. Finch I wouldn't do it. It's not right." Daniel, who had been listening in silence, looked at his son, a profound sense of pride replacing the weariness in his eyes. Margaret squeezed Thomas's arm, her unspoken approval a warm balm. Sarah, looking up from her conversation with Grandmother Murphy, smiled at her brother, a smile of pure, uncomplicated admiration. In that small, crowded room, surrounded by the echoes of shared struggle, Thomas had made his choice, a choice that reaffirmed the Murphys' values, a small victory of principle over temptation, a quiet testament to the enduring strength of their family's moral compass. Daniel, now fully immersed in the tenement reform movement, found a new kind of work, one that taxed his mind and spirit more than his body. He spent his days walking the crowded blocks of the Lower East Side, observing, listening, and documenting. He became a trusted guide for Jakob Riis, leading the photographer to the darkest corners of the city, to the dilapidated alleys, the overflowing privies, the airless rooms where disease thrived. Riis's camera flashed, capturing the undeniable evidence, while Daniel provided the human stories, the names and faces behind the statistics. He became adept at navigating the complex web of tenement life, earning the trust of skeptical residents who initially viewed him, like Riis, as just another outsider. He spoke their languages, a few words of Yiddish, a phrase in Italian, a sympathetic nod in Polish, learned through years of shared labour and proximity. He heard their grievances, their fears, their small triumphs, and channeled them into powerful narratives that Riis could use in his articles and lectures. Their collaboration quickly caught the attention of other reformers. Lillian Wald, a pioneering nurse and social worker who had established the Henry Street settlement, a beacon of hope in the neighbourhood, sought out Daniel and Riis. She recognized in Daniel a natural leader, a man of the people who could bridge the gap between the impoverished residents and the well-meaning but often detached reformers. Walled Settlement House offered a holistic approach to reform, providing not just medical care and education, but also advocating for systemic change. Daniel found a kindred spirit in Wold, a woman whose fierce compassion was matched by her pragmatic determination. He began working closely with the settlement, organising neighbourhood committees, empowering residents to voice their own demands for better sanitation, improved housing, and access to public services. He also found himself increasingly drawn into the political arena. He attended city council meetings, often speaking passionately about the need for new housing codes, for enforcement of existing health regulations, and for an end to the predatory practices of slum landlords. His voice, once confined to the factory floor, now echoed in the halls of power, a raw, undeniable testament to the suffering of his community. He learned the slow, frustrating dance of bureaucracy, the endless committees, the political manoeuvring that often stymied genuine progress. But he also saw small victories: a leaky communal pump repaired, a landlord fined for unsanitary conditions, a new public bathhouse proposed. Each small step, he knew, was a hard-won battle. Back in the tenement, Margaret observed Daniel's new path with a mix of pride and apprehension. She admired his courage, his unwavering commitment to justice, but she also worried about the risks. Activism, even peaceful advocacy, could still draw the ire of powerful interests. The blacklisting from the docks, while a financial blow, had inadvertently freed Daniel to pursue this new calling. Yet, the family's financial situation remained precarious. Margaret continued her relentless piecework, her fingers flying over fabric, her mind constantly calculating their meagre budget. The garment industry had seen some improvements due to the strike, but the work was still demanding, the pay still barely enough to cover their needs. She took on extra mending work from neighbours, her skill with a needle a valuable commodity in their community. She also found herself increasingly involved in the informal networks of mutual aid, organising food for families facing hardship, caring for sick neighbours, a quiet, unsung leader in her own right. Thomas, witnessing his father's new role, found his own understanding of ambition deepening. It wasn't just about personal success. It was about how one could use one's skills to make a difference. His clerical work at the shipping office, once viewed as a path to escape the tenements, now seemed like a tool to understand the very systems his father sought to reform. He began to apply his keen, analytical mind to the problems of urban poverty, studying economic reports, analysing property records, trying to understand the root causes of their communal plight. He saw how the same forces that created wealth also perpetuated poverty, a complex interconnected web of capital and labour. Sarah, inspired by her father's activism and her mother's quiet strength, dedicated herself to her education with renewed fervour. Her work at the parish library connected her to a wider world of ideas, to the intellectual ferment of the city. She devoured books on social justice, on history, on the burgeoning women's rights movement. She wrote essays in her small notebook, articulating her own observations about the inequalities she witnessed, her voice, though still young, developing a sharp, insightful edge. She began to volunteer with Lillian Wald's Settlement House, reading to children, assisting with basic hygiene lessons, seeing firsthand the transformative power of education and compassion. She was a silent chronicler, a nascent intellectual, preparing herself for a future where she too could contribute to the ongoing struggle for a better world. The tenement, despite its inherent hardships, continued to be a place of remarkable resilience and vibrant community. The Murphys, now more deeply embedded in its social fabric than ever, found strength and purpose in their collective struggle. The winter, always a brutal test, was weathered through shared fires, communal meals, and the warmth of human connection. Neighbours looked out for neighbours, a tacit agreement of mutual survival against the indifferent forces of the city. Daniel's advocacy, coupled with Rees's powerful imagery, and Wald's organised efforts, began to chip away at the formidable wall of civic apathy. The public, spurred by the stark revelations, demanded action. City officials, recognising the growing political pressure, could no longer ignore the squalid conditions of the tenements. Whispers of new legislation, of comprehensive housing reforms, began to circulate in the halls of power. Daniel found himself speaking at increasingly prominent forums, not just in dimly lit union halls but in churches, civic organisations, and even, on occasion, before committees of concerned citizens. His voice, once hesitant, now carried the weight of authenticity. His experiences a living testament to the need for change. He learned to articulate the complex interplay of poverty, disease and exploitation, drawing connections that many wealthier citizens had never considered. He emphasised that the health of the tenements was inextricably linked to the health of the entire city, a powerful argument that resonated with those who feared the spread of epidemics beyond the crowded districts. One particularly contentious debate centred on the demolition of the worst rear tenements, structures built behind existing buildings, blocking light and air, creating disease traps. Landlords vehemently opposed such measures, citing property rights and financial losses. Daniel, armed with Rees's photographs and Wald's statistics, countered their arguments with the undeniable human cost of their greed. He spoke of Mrs. Kowalski, of the children lost to consumption, of the daily struggle for breath in airless rooms. His passion, rooted in personal experience, proved more compelling than any legal brief. Margaret, while not directly involved in public advocacy, played an equally crucial role. She became a hub of information and support within their building, a trusted confidant for women grappling with illness, unemployment, and the daily grind. She organised informal childcare networks, allowing mothers to take on piecework or attend meetings. She coordinated communal cooking efforts, ensuring that no family went entirely hungry during hard times. Her quiet leadership, her unwavering compassion, formed the bedrock of their community's resilience. She was the unsung hero, the invisible architect of survival. Thomas, from his perch in the shipping office, observed the political machinations with a detached but analytical eye. He saw how compromises were made, how vested interests fought tooth and nail, how even well-intentioned reforms could be diluted or undermined. He also learned the importance of meticulous data. Rees and Wald relied on accurate facts and figures to bolster their arguments, and Thomas, with his growing skill in record-keeping, began to discreetly assist them, sifting through public records, analysing demographic data, providing the empirical evidence that lent weight to their cause. He understood that true change required not just passion, but also precision, not just moral outrage, but also irrefutable facts. Sarah, now a diligent volunteer at the Henry Street settlement, was not only learning but also teaching. She ran literacy classes for young immigrant girls, using her beloved slate pencil and Thomas's old school books. She taught them English, not just as a language, but as a tool for empowerment, a key to unlock the new world around them. She shared the stories of the remarkable women she read about, inspiring her students with tales of courage and resilience. She also learned from them, from their diverse cultures, their unique perspectives, their shared hopes. She saw how education, even in its most basic form, could be a transformative force, giving agency to those who had historically been denied a voice. The Murphys, though still living in their cramped tenement room, felt a shift. The constant pressure of survival remained, but it was now tempered by a sense of purpose, a belief that their struggles were not in vain. They were part of a larger movement, a tide of change slowly but inexorably rising against the injustices of their time. The city, in its relentless churn, was slowly being forced to confront its own shadows, to acknowledge the human cost of its glittering progress. And in their small corner of the Lower East Side, the Murphy family, through their individual choices and collective efforts, was helping to write a new chapter in the story of America. Spring arrived, bringing with it a sense of renewal, not just in the natural world, but in the political landscape of New York. The tireless efforts of reformers like Daniel, Jacob Rees, and Lillian Wald began to bear fruit. New housing legislation, though fiercely contested, was finally making its way through the city council, promising stricter building codes, improved sanitation, and the eventual demolition of the most egregious rear tenements. It was a slow, incremental victory, but a victory nonetheless, a testament to the power of persistent advocacy. Daniel, now a recognised voice in the reform movement, found his days filled with meetings, lectures, and visits to other tenement districts, sharing his experiences and strategies. He was no longer just a longshoreman or an ironworker. He was an advocate, a community leader. The blacklisting, once a crushing blow, had inadvertently opened up a new path for him, one where his lived experience was his most powerful credential. He still worried about the family's finances, but the belief in his purpose, the knowledge that he was fighting for a better future for his children and his community sustained him. His work brought him into contact with a wider array of people, not just the impoverished, but also sympathetic lawyers, philanthropists, and even some forward-thinking politicians. He learned the language of policy and law, understanding how to translate the raw suffering of the tenements into legislative action. He found a new kind of satisfaction in this work, a sense of shaping the world around him, not just enduring it. Margaret, meanwhile, saw a different kind of progress unfolding. The Garment Workers' Union, buoyed by their recent concessions, was organising more aggressively, pushing for better wages and safer conditions across the industry. Margaret, a quiet but steadfast presence, found herself becoming a mentor to younger women, sharing her experiences, offering advice, and reminding them of the power of solidarity. She organised literacy circles in the evenings, helping her fellow seamstresses learn to read and write, understanding that education was another key to empowerment. Her small room often became a gathering place, a sanctuary for women seeking advice, comfort, and camaraderie. Thomas's work at the shipping office continued to expand his horizons. He was now involved in drafting proposals for more efficient cargo management, his analytical skills proving invaluable to his superiors. He learned about global supply chains, the intricacies of international trade, and the burgeoning financial markets. His ambition was still strong, but it was tempered by a growing understanding of social responsibility. He discreetly used his knowledge to identify companies with ethical labour practices, guiding his family and friends towards potential employment opportunities that aligned with their values. He also continued to provide Rees and Veld with crucial data, demonstrating the economic benefits of improved living and working conditions, a language that resonated with the city's powerful elite. But perhaps the most profound transformation was taking place with Sarah. Her work at the Henry Street Settlements Library and her literacy classes for immigrant girls ignited a passion for education and social justice. She devoured every book she could find, not just stories but texts on sociology, urban planning and public health. She became an eager pupil of Lillian Wald, shadowing the nurse on her rounds, witnessing firsthand the devastating impact of poverty and disease, but also the transformative power of compassionate care. One afternoon, a wealthy patron of the settlement, a philanthropic woman named Mrs. Vanderbilt, visited the library. She was impressed by Sarah's intelligence, her fluency in several languages, and her passionate commitment to teaching. "Such a bright young woman," Mrs. Vanderbilt remarked to Lillian Wald. "She should have the opportunity for a proper education." A few weeks later, an extraordinary offer arrived, a scholarship to a new, progressive women's college that had recently opened in New York, dedicated to educating young women from diverse backgrounds, particularly those with a commitment to social service. It was an opportunity that, just a few years ago, would have been unimaginable for a tenement girl. The news was met with a mixture of excitement and apprehension in the Murphy household. A college education. It was a distant, almost mythical concept. It meant Sarah would leave the tenement, leave the daily struggle to pursue a path far removed from anything her family had ever known. Margaret worried about her daughter's safety, about the dangers of a world she didn't understand. Daniel, though immensely proud, felt a pang of fear for the unknown, for the potential distance this would create between Sarah and their working-class roots. But Sarah's eyes, when she spoke of the college, shone with an unwavering light. "It's not just for me, Pa, Ma," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "It's so I can learn how to help more, to make a real difference like Lillian Wald, like Mr. Rees, like you, Pa." In her words, Daniel saw the realization of the immigrant dream, not just for personal advancement, but for the empowerment of the next generation, for the ability to effect change on a larger scale. He remembered his own decision to refuse Harrison's offer, a choice made for principle, for solidarity. This was the fruit of that choice, a seed of hope blossoming in the most unexpected of places. "She goes," Daniel said, his voice firm, settling the debate. "We'll find a way." And so, the Murphys, a family forged in the fires of the tenements, prepared for another profound transformation. Sarah, the quiet chronicler, the avid reader, was about to embark on a journey that would take her far beyond the confines of their single room, armed with a fierce intellect and an unwavering heart, ready to become a force for change in the evolving landscape of America. The tenement, once a symbol of their confinement, was now the launching pad for their children's dreams, a testament to the enduring power of human spirit against overwhelming odds. Sarah's departure for college marked a new era for the Murphy family. The small tenement room felt even emptier without her quiet presence, but her absence was filled with the powerful potential of her future. The scholarship covered tuition, but the family still had to manage her living expenses, a new strain on their already stretched budget. Margaret took on even more piecework, her fingers often stiff with fatigue late into the night. Daniel continued his advocacy work, finding small, irregular stipends from various reform organizations, a recognition of his invaluable contribution. Sarah quickly thrived in the collegiate environment. She was often one of the few students from a working-class immigrant background, and the contrast between her tenement upbringing and the privileged backgrounds of many of her peers was stark. Yet she brought a unique perspective, a fierce intellect honed by observation and hardship, and an unwavering commitment to social justice. She excelled in her studies, particularly in sociology, history and economics, eager to understand the systemic forces that shaped lives like hers. She found a mentor in a progressive professor, Dr. Eleanor Vance, who encouraged her to channel her personal experiences into academic research. Sarah's essays on tenement life, richly detailed and deeply empathetic, quickly gained recognition. She wrote about the dignity of labour, the resilience of immigrant communities, and the devastating human cost of unchecked industrialization, her words echoing the very stories her father and mother had lived. During her break, Sarah returned to the tenement, not just to visit her family, but to continue her work with Lillian Wald at the Henry Street settlement. She applied her academic knowledge to practical challenges, organising health clinics, developing educational programs for women, and conducting surveys on housing conditions. She became a bridge between the academic world of theory and the on-the-ground realities of poverty, her voice growing increasingly articulate and influential. Meanwhile, Daniel's activism gained further traction. He became a prominent figure in the burgeoning labour and housing reform movements. His speeches, now polished by experience and supported by data from Thomas and Sarah, resonated deeply with public audiences. He collaborated closely with Jacob Riis, whose book, How the Other Half Lives, a groundbreaking exposé of tenement conditions, was gaining national attention. Daniel's stories, anonymously woven throughout the book, gave it a visceral, undeniable power. One significant triumph was the successful lobbying for the Tenement House Act of 1901. Though passed years later, Daniel's early, tireless advocacy for improved housing codes played a crucial foundational role. It mandated stricter light and air requirements, improved sanitation, and greater fire safety. It was a testament to years of struggle, a tangible victory against entrenched interests. Daniel, standing in a crowded hall as the bill was announced, felt a wave of profound satisfaction, knowing that his sacrifices, his refusal to compromise, had not been in vain. Thomas, in his increasingly senior role at the shipping office, continued his quiet ascent. He mastered the intricacies of maritime law and international commerce, becoming an indispensable asset to the firm. His network expanded to include influential merchants, lawyers, and even some politicians. He learned to navigate the complex world of power and influence, always remembering his father's principles, using his position not just for personal gain, but for subtle acts of assistance to his community. He discreetly helped immigrant families with paperwork, provided information that could prevent exploitation, and advised his father on the economic arguments for reform. His personal life also began to take shape. He reconnected with Esther, Rosa Abramovitz's cousin, now a young woman who, having learned English and found steady work, was a vibrant and intelligent member of the community. Their shared tenement upbringing, their understanding of struggle, formed a deep bond. Thomas saw in her a partner who understood his ambitions, but also shared his commitment to their people. Their courtship was quiet, respectful, and filled with a mutual understanding.